What if the secret to peace was not doing more but letting go? In a world full of noise, pressure, and endless thinking, Zen whispers a different path. These rare Zen stories are like small lanterns, gently lighting the way to a quieter mind and a lighter heart. Each one shows how freedom isn't found by chasing life, but by stepping back from it. As you spend time with these stories, you may find that the less you hold on to, the more peace you carry. Let's get started. The monk who returned his shadow. Long ago, in a quiet temple nestled in the northern mountains of Japan, there lived a monk named Riken. He was known for his strict discipline and tireless effort in meditation. Each morning before sunrise, he would sit alone for hours, eyes closed, unmoving like stone. He followed every rule, spoke only when needed, and kept his cell spotless. To others, he seemed like a perfect monk, but inside, Riken carried a secret fear. He could not stop judging others who were not as devoted as he was. He believed that purity came from separation, from distancing oneself from what is flawed or messy. One night, as the moon hung low and the wind whistled through the old pine trees, Riken noticed something strange. In the moonlight, his shadow followed him along the wall. But it looked different, darker, almost thicker than usual. He dismissed it, but the next day it was still there. In the garden, in the corridor, in the meditation hall, wherever he went, the strange shadow followed. It started to disturb him. He began scrubbing his robes longer, cleaning his cell more often, meditating even harder. But still, the shadow remained. Finally, he went to the old abbot and confessed his growing fear. The abbot simply smiled and said, "Even the purest flame still casts a shadow. The more you flee from it, the darker it becomes." Riken didn't understand. That night, in desperation, he went into the forest behind the temple and sat alone. As he gazed at his shadow under the full moon, something softened in him. He whispered, "I see you." And for the first time, he didn't try to push it away. He stayed there until morning. When he returned to the temple, he walked slower, breathed easier. He no longer frowned at the junior monks who stumbled in their practice. He stopped trying to be spotless. He smiled more, laughed quietly during meals, and even helped clean up when others forgot. Moral of the story: true detachment isn't the rejection of our imperfections, but the gentle return to them. Just as a shadow is part of the light, our flaws remind us we are human. Only by embracing what we once rejected do we become whole. In seeing our shadow not as an enemy but as a part of us, we free ourselves from judgment and grow lighter in spirit. The next story is called No Sound Beyond the Mist. There was once a secluded monastery perched high on a mountain peak, so remote that it seemed to float above the world. Each morning, the monks would awaken before dawn to meditate in silence as the clouds drifted below them like slow-moving rivers. Among them was a young monk named Ao, whose heart longed for peace but whose mind never rested. No matter how long he sat in stillness, thoughts flooded in, worries, memories, and questions about enlightenment. One morning, as a heavy mist covered the entire monastery, Ao approached the old master Junrei and confessed, "I try so hard to quiet my mind, but the thoughts are louder than ever. Why can't I find peace like the others?" Master Junrei looked out toward the fog and said, "Go beyond the garden where the bell is and sit facing the mist. Stay there until you hear no sound." Ao bowed and obeyed. He sat beside the bell, listening. At first, he could hear the faint rustling of trees, the call of distant birds, the sound of his own breath. Hours passed. The mist grew thicker. The world disappeared into a gray silence. Soon, even the birds stopped. The breeze stilled. There were no sounds, just the presence of the mist. At that moment, Ao noticed something he had never felt before. In the absence of all sound, he began to hear something deeper, not a noise, but a space, a stillness. It wasn't empty, it was alive. Tears welled in his eyes, not because he was sad, but because in that absolute quiet, something fell away from him. The noise in his head lost its grip. His thoughts were still there, but they no longer shouted. They passed through him like the mist, soft and without weight. When he returned, Master Junrei only asked, "And what did you hear?" Ayo replied, "I heard nothing." But somehow, that nothing was everything. Moral of the story: silence is not the absence of sound, it is the space where truth reveals itself. In a world full of noise, the mind learns to shout, but in stillness, the spirit begins to whisper. Detachment does not mean escaping life, but entering it so fully that the noise loses meaning. In the mist, when nothing can be seen or heard, peace is no longer searched, for it is simply found. The next story is called The Temple Bell That Rang Without a Ringer. High in the mountains of Korea stood a weathered Zen temple, quiet and ancient. At its heart hung a massive bronze bell, centuries old, suspended above a polished stone floor. This bell had not been rung in over 20 years. It was tradition that only the abbot, upon great spiritual realization, could ring it. No monk dared approach it unless summoned. Among the younger monks was Hanol, a quiet student who often wandered alone. He never spoke much, but he listened to wind through the pines, to rain on the tiled roof, to the creaking of the wood beneath his bare feet. He was not the most disciplined, nor the most praised. But his mind was gentle, and he carried no ambition. One night, during a fierce storm, thunder rolled across the sky and lightning lit up the valley. The monks stayed in their quarters, meditating through the noise. But Hanol, drawn by something he couldn't name, walked silently into the great hall. He felt no fear, only stillness. The bell stood untouched in the center, its metal cold and wet from a leak in the roof above. As he sat near it, he did not chant or bow. He only breathed. As the storm raged outside, he remained unmoving. Then, just before dawn, as the wind settled into silence, the bell rang. No one had touched it. It rang once clear, soft, and deep. The sound echoed through the empty corridors and stirred the sleeping monks. They rushed into the hall, expecting something broken or wrong. But there was nothing, only Hanol, seated beside the bell, his eyes calm and filled with tears. The abbot arrived last. He looked at Hanol for a long time before speaking. "It has rung," he whispered, "not by hand, but by presence." Hanol never spoke of that night again. He returned to sweeping the paths, feeding the birds, and meditating under the trees. But something had changed, not in him, but around him. Others began to feel quieter in his presence, as though the silence of the bell had entered him. Moral of the story: true stillness speaks without sound. When the heart is empty of wanting, it becomes full of presence. Some awakenings do not shout. They arrive like dawn light through fog, touching everything without effort. Detachment is not turning away. It is becoming so still that the world moves through you, and even the silent will ring. The next story is called The Bamboo That Refused to Grow. In a small Zen monastery surrounded by dense forest, a young monk named Toshi was assigned to care for the temple garden. It was considered a sacred duty, not just planting and watering, but learning to see the quiet teachings of nature. Toshi took this task seriously. He listened to the soil, studied the rhythm of seasons, and treated each leaf with reverence. One spring, the abbot gave Toshi a single bamboo shoot. "Plant this," he said, "and care for it with patience. It will show you something words cannot." Toshi bowed and chose a quiet corner of the garden. He cleared the weeds, prepared the soil, and planted the bamboo. Every day, he watered it and sat beside it in silence. He whispered mantras to it and shielded it from harsh winds. Weeks passed, then months. But the bamboo did not grow. Other plants in the garden flourished, flowers bloomed, trees bore fruit. But the bamboo shoot remained unchanged, no taller, no stronger. Toshi began to worry. He tried more water, less water, changing the soil, moving nearby plants. Still nothing. After 3 years, he approached the abbot in frustration. "Master, I've done everything. I care for it with my whole heart, but it refuses to grow. Have I failed?" The abbot smiled and walked with him to the garden. He sat beside the unmoved bamboo and said, "This bamboo is teaching you exactly what you need to learn. While it appears not to grow above the surface, it is deepening its roots. It is preparing. If it rushed upward too soon, it would fall with the first wind." Toshi stared at the shoot, eyes softening. He had been waiting for progress, for a sign of success. But nature moved by its own clock, not his. He nodded, and from that day on, he let go. He continued to care for the bamboo, but without impatience, without needing anything in return. The next spring, in one quiet week, the bamboo grew taller than the garden wall. Moral of the story: growth is not always visible. In stillness, in waiting, in seasons of silence, the roots of wisdom deepen. Detachment means caring fully, but not clinging to outcomes. Like the bamboo, the soul prepares beneath the surface long before it rises. Trust the unseen. Not all progress is meant to be seen. Some of it must be felt. The next story is called "The Ink That Disappeared Before Writing." In the ancient city of Luoyang, there lived a Zen calligrapher named Yoru. His scrolls were known far beyond the temple walls, not just for their beauty, but for the quiet presence they carried. People said you could feel stillness in his brush strokes. One day, a young monk named Nari came to study under him. Eager to learn, Nari practiced day and night, carefully mimicking Yoru's flowing characters. But no matter how hard he tried, his writing felt stiff, too controlled, like it came from effort, not stillness. Frustrated, he begged Master Yoru, "Please teach me your secret. How do you make each stroke feel alive?" Yoru said nothing. Instead, he handed Nari an empty scroll, a small dish of ink, and a brush. "Go to the meditation hall at sunrise. Do not write until the ink disappears." Nari was confused, but obeyed. He dipped the brush, ready to write. But as soon as the ink touched the paper, it vanished. Nothing remained. Line after line disappeared before his eyes. He tried again and again, but each time, the words dissolved into the scroll as if they had never been there. Days passed. Nari returned every morning, painting strokes that vanished. At first he felt angry, then confused, then quiet. By the 7th day, something shifted. He began writing without concern. He didn't worry about the form, the pressure of the brush, or even whether the ink would stay. He simply moved the brush, gently, with breath, as if writing on water. The act became the meditation. The page no longer needed to be filled, his mind was. When he returned the scroll to Yoru, the master unrolled it. It was blank. Yoru smiled. "Now you understand. True calligraphy is not in the ink, but in the hand that lets go of needing to leave a mark." Nari bowed deeply. He had written nothing, but learned everything. Moral of the story: true expression arises when we release the need to be seen, remembered, or praised. Detachment means letting go of the desire to leave a trace. The most powerful acts may leave no mark at all, but they change us. Just like ink that disappears, what matters is not what remains on the page, but what awakens in the soul. The next story is called "A Master's Answer with One Grain of Rice." In a quiet Zen temple by the sea, pilgrims often came from far away to seek the wisdom of Master Nanko. He was known not for long teachings, but for answers so brief they felt like riddles, yet they often changed lives. His students believed he could see directly into their hearts. and he often spoke with gestures, silence, or even laughter instead of words. One day, a scholar named Dazen arrived from the city. He had studied the sutras, debated with monks from many schools, and written many papers on the meaning of detachment. Yet, something in him still felt heavy. His thoughts never stopped racing, and his heart never felt light. He came to Master Nanko with a proud posture and a satchel full of notes. Bowing, he asked, "Master, I have read countless texts on Zen and emptiness. I understand the teachings. But how do I live them? How do I truly detach?" Master Nanko looked at him gently. Without a word, he reached into the folds of his robe and pulled out a single grain of rice. He held it out on the tip of his finger, then slowly dropped it to the ground. Daizan stared, confused. "Is that all?" he asked. "A grain of rice?" The master smiled and said quietly, "Even one grain can be too much if the hand refuses to let go." The words hit Daizan harder than any debate or lecture ever had. He sat in silence, stunned not because he didn't understand, but because he did. He suddenly saw how tightly he held his knowledge, how attached he had become to his need to explain, prove, and master life. His thoughts had become his chains, and even the smallest idea he clung to weighed him down. He looked at the grain of rice on the floor. It was nothing tiny, silent, simple, yet it had shown him what years of study had not. Moral of the story: sometimes the smallest thing can reveal the greatest truth. Detachment doesn't mean giving up everything. It means loosening the grip on even one small thing we think we must control. Peace is not found in gathering more, but in releasing what we no longer need to carry. Even one grain of thought, if held too tightly, can keep the heart from being free. The next story is called The Candle That Refused to Cast a Shadow. In a quiet Zen temple by the edge of a lake, there was a ritual held only once every 10 years. On the night of the full moon, a single candle was lit in the center of the meditation hall. Monks would sit in complete silence as the flame flickered. It was said this candle had been passed down for generations and carried with it a mystery that no one could explain. One year, a curious novice named Sora arrived just before the sacred night. He had heard stories about this candle, that it was no ordinary light. It was said to reveal something to those who truly watched not with the eyes, but with presence. That night, the hall filled with soft breathing and still bodies. The abbot lit the candle, then stepped back. Sora watched closely. The flame danced, soft and golden, steady yet alive. But as he stared at the candle, he noticed something that made his heart pause. There was no shadow behind it. The floor behind the candle was bare. No flicker, no outline, no trace of darkness. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, looked again. Every monk in the room cast a faint shadow under the moonlight filtering through the window. Even the altar and cushions had shape and shade. But the candle stood alone, untouched by darkness. The more he watched, the quieter his thoughts became. He was no longer trying to understand, only to be with it. A feeling spread through him, both emptiness and fullness. Like the candle, something in him stopped resisting. He no longer needed answers. When the ceremony ended, Sora approached the abbot. "Why doesn't the candle cast a shadow?" he asked, voice trembling. The abbot smiled gently. "Because it doesn't need to prove its light." From that day, Sora's practice changed. He no longer compared himself to others. He no longer tried to shine brighter or worry about being seen. Like the candle, he became content to simply be light without needing to cast anything behind. Moral of the story: true light does not compete. It does not cast shadows to prove it exists. Detachment is when we stop trying to be seen and start resting in what we are. The brightest presence often leaves no trace, only warmth. Let go of the need to reflect, just burn. Quietly, from within. The next story is called The Student Who Was Taught by a Raindrop. In a valley where the mountains kissed the sky and clouds floated like whispers, there was a Zen temple known for its quietness. The monks there walked barefoot on moss, drank from cold springs, and meditated beneath trees that had stood for centuries. Among them was a young student named Sora, whose name meant sky. But unlike his name, Sora's mind was crowded, filled with worry, ambition, and restlessness. Every day he meditated in the forest, and every day he left frustrated. "Why is my mind so noisy?" he would ask himself. "Why can't I feel peace like the others?" One morning, after a sleepless night, Sora climbed to a rock by a still pond. The sky was grey, the air thick with coming rain. He sat down, too tired to try, too drained to fight his thoughts. "I give up," he whispered. "Let the rain come." And it did. The first drop fell gently on a leaf beside him. Then another. Then another. He watched them without meaning to. One raindrop slid down the smooth edge of the leaf and paused, perfect, round, silent, before falling into the pond. The sound it made was small, almost nothing, but in that moment, Sora's breath caught. He saw the drop. How it didn't resist the fall, how it let go without fear, how it landed, disappeared, and yet rippled across the water. It didn't cling, it didn't hesitate, it simply fell. For the first time, Sora stopped thinking. His heart opened like the sky he was named after. And the rain kept falling, not harsh or loud, but gentle, like a lesson spoken in a voice so soft you could only hear it when you stopped everything else. He stayed there until the clouds passed. When he returned to the temple, he didn't mention the raindrop, but something had changed. He no longer tried to force silence, he welcomed it. He no longer struggled with his thoughts, he watched them fall like drops into still water. Moral of the story: nature teaches when words cannot. One raindrop can hold the wisdom of 100 books. Detachment is not a battle, it's the simple act of letting go, again and again, like rain from a leaf. When we stop grasping, we begin to hear. When we stop chasing peace, we realize it was quietly falling all along. The next story is called When the Teacup Taught the Teacher. In a hillside temple shaded by tall cedars, an elderly Zen teacher named Master Kaito was known far and wide for his wisdom. Students traveled from distant villages to sit with him, to ask questions, to drink from the deep well of his insight. He was calm, clear-eyed, and always ready with a lesson. One spring morning, a scholar from the city arrived. He was a professor of philosophy, proud of his knowledge, and eager to meet the famous master. When he sat before Kaito, he bowed respectfully but wasted no time. "I've studied the great texts," the scholar said. "I've debated the principles of emptiness and form, illusion and self. I've come to understand the truth, and I seek only your confirmation." Master Kaito said nothing. He only gestured toward a small table between them and began to pour tea. The scholar continued talking, listing ideas, quoting verses, arguing subtle points. As he spoke, Master Kaito quietly filled the cup. But he did not stop. The tea rose to the rim, then spilled over. It streamed down the sides and onto the floor. The scholar jumped up. "Master, the cup is overflowing." Kaito looked up at him gently. "Like this cup," he said, "you are full of your own thoughts. How can I offer anything unless you first empty your cup?" The scholar froze. His mouth slowly closed. In that small moment, something deeper than words broke open inside him. He saw his endless grasping, his need to prove, to know, to be right. And he saw how heavy it all was. He bowed again, this time not from politeness, but from humility. For the rest of the day, they sat in silence. The scholar asked no more questions. The teacher offered no more answers. The teacup, now still, sat between them half full or half empty, it didn't matter. Moral of the story: real wisdom begins where certainty ends. Detachment is not about giving up knowledge, it's about releasing the pride that clings to it. When we let go of needing to be right, we create space to truly see, to hear, and to grow. The mind, like a cup, must be emptied before it can be filled with truth. The next story is called He Asked the Wind What to Do. In the open grasslands of central China, where the land stretches wide beneath an endless sky, a wandering monk named Yuto walked alone. He had left his temple after years of disciplined practice, not in anger or rebellion, but in quiet confusion. Though he had memorized sutras, passed tests, and impressed his teachers, he still felt uncertain. He often whispered to himself, "What should I do with my life? Where should I go? How do I live without clinging?" One evening, as twilight turned the sky gold, Yuto sat beneath a crooked tree, tired from walking. The wind blew softly through the tall grass. It brushed his face, danced in the leaves, and moved on. Feeling lost, he looked out over the hills and asked aloud, "Wind, what should I do?" There was no answer, only the hush of the breeze. But something in the way it moved made him listen deeper. It rustled the grass, stirred the trees, swirled around him, and kept going, never stopping, never holding anything. It passed through everything, yet belonged nowhere. Suddenly, tears filled Yuto's eyes. He wasn't sad, he just understood. The wind had answered, not with words, but with its nature. It didn't ask where to go, it didn't try to stay still. It moved freely, gently, without needing to hold or own or decide. It simply moved where it could, and that was enough. That night, Yuto didn't make a new plan. He didn't choose a new temple or path. He simply stood, breathed with the wind, and walked on. From then on, he stopped asking life for answers in words. He paid attention to movement, to how things bent, shifted, flowed. He began to live like the wind, not owning, not forcing, just being, lightly and fully. Years later, those who met him said there was something unshakable about him, something peaceful, as if he knew what to do, even when doing nothing, as if he heard answers others had forgotten how to hear. Moral of the story: not all questions need to be answered with words. The wind teaches by moving, not by speaking. Detachment is not always a choice, it is a way of being. When we stop chasing certainty, we begin to trust the flow. Like the wind, we can pass through this world with grace, belonging nowhere, yet touching everything. The next story is called The Hermit Who Grew Invisible. In a deep forest where no roads reached, there lived a hermit named Ryo. Long ago, he had left the world behind his name, his wealth, even his voice. He had no possessions, no visitors, and no fixed home. He lived beneath trees, drank from streams, and followed no schedule but the sun and moon. Villagers nearby whispered stories about him. Some said he was mad, others said he was enlightened, but no one ever saw him. One day, a young monk named Kiku, full of questions and restlessness, decided to find Ryo. If I can meet him, he thought, I'll finally understand what it means to be free. He walked for days into the forest, listening for movement, scanning the trees. Then, near a moss-covered stone, he saw footprints in the earth, but no person. Kiku followed them until they vanished at the edge of a stream. There was no sound, no presence, just the wind and the water. "Master Ryo," he called out, "are you there?" A voice, soft and clear, replied from somewhere close. "Why are you looking for someone?" Kiku spun around. "I came to learn, to understand how to let go." The voice replied, "Then stop looking for me and start letting go." The monk sat down right where he was, confused and humbled. Days passed. He stayed in that spot, eating berries, listening to the leaves fall. The forest did not answer him, yet it changed him. His thoughts slowed, his breath softened. On the third morning, as the sun filtered through the canopy, Kiku felt someone nearby. He turned but saw nothing. Yet strangely, he felt calm, as if the forest itself had acknowledged him. Then the voice came again, closer now. "You've seen me," it said. "But I haven't," Kiku replied. The voice answered gently, "That is what it means." Kiku understood. Rio hadn't vanished from the world. He had simply stopped needing to be seen. In shedding all desire for identity, importance, or recognition, he had become like the breeze present, but free. The monk bowed deeply to the empty forest and walked back, lighter than he had come. Moral of the story: true detachment is not about hiding from the world, it is the quiet shedding of the self that demands attention. When we stop seeking to be noticed, we become part of something greater. In becoming nothing, we become everything. Letting go of identity, we begin to truly exist. The next story is called The Shoeless Pilgrim Who Found Nothing. Along a dry and winding path that cut through the valleys of ancient India, there walked a lone pilgrim. His name was Aran, and he wore no shoes. His feet were cracked from stone and sun, yet he walked without complaint. Decades earlier, Aran had left his village in search of truth. He had visited holy men, read sacred texts, and climbed mountains looking for answers. Each place promised something, yet each time the promise faded into silence. Still, he walked. One afternoon, after many years of wandering, he reached a vast plain of dust and wind. His robes were thin, and his body tired, but something in him whispered that this place held what he had been searching for. He dropped to his knees and cried out, "Great Spirit, I have given up everything. I've abandoned my family, comfort, possessions. Why have I still found nothing?" There was no reply, only wind and empty space. He sat there until night came, and in the silence of the stars, something inside him broke not in pain, but in surrender. For the first time, he stopped needing an answer. He stopped expecting the journey to reward him. He just sat. The dust clung to his skin. His breath slowed. He watched as a beetle crawled past, as the stars blinked above, as the wind brushed his face like a hand he couldn't see. He felt small, invisible, empty. And for the first time, that emptiness felt like peace. He laughed softly, like a man waking from a long dream. "There's nothing to find," he whispered, "and nothing missing." In that quiet field, with no shoes, no map, and no destination, Aaron finally stopped being a seeker and became simply a being. Years later, people who heard of the Shoeless One came to visit him, but he had nothing to give, no teachings, no rituals, no steps to follow. He only sat and smiled. And somehow, in that smile, others felt lighter too. Moral of the story: sometimes we find everything only when we stop searching. Detachment is not giving up the path, it's giving up the need for it to lead somewhere. The truth is not always hidden at the end of the road, it often waits quietly in the dust under your bare feet. The next story is called The Laughing Master Who Never Spoke. In a quiet temple on the edge of a windswept desert, there lived an old Zen master known only as the Laughing One. No one remembered his real name. He had not spoken a word in over 40 years. Yet every morning, at sunrise, he would walk through the temple courtyard, smiling gently and sometimes laughing. Not a wild or mocking laugh, but soft, bright, and full of something impossible to describe. New monks were always puzzled. "Why doesn't he speak?" they asked. "How can he teach if he never gives a single instruction?" But the elder monks only smiled and said, "Stay long enough, and you'll understand." A young monk named Yuto arrived, full of questions and sharp intelligence. He had read many sutras and practiced every ritual with perfect precision. Still, something in him remained unsettled. He felt a constant weight in his chest, as though no amount of knowledge could free him. One morning, after meditation, he approached the laughing master in the courtyard. The old man was watering a single flower that grew between two stones. He looked up at Yuto, met his eyes and laughed. Yuto bowed and asked, "Master, what is the source of your peace? Please teach me." The master only smiled again, laughed gently, and walked away. This happened every day. Yuto would ask. The master would laugh, never a word, no gesture, just presence. At first, Yuto grew frustrated, then ashamed, then confused. But he kept coming. Every day, he stood before the master, slowly learning to let go of his need for answers. One morning, Yuto simply stood there in silence, eyes open, breath still. The master approached, looked at him, and for the first time, placed a hand on his shoulder. Their eyes met. And then both laughed. Something broke open in Yuto's chest, like a window that had been closed for years. Not a word had been spoken, yet something deeper than language had passed between them. The peace he was chasing had always been there, buried under noise and seeking. Moral of the story: some truths are too pure for words. Detachment is not learned through explanations, but felt through presence. When we stop needing to understand, we begin to experience. The deepest wisdom often comes in silence, and sometimes in laughter. The next story is called The Scroll That Read Itself. In an ancient temple built at the edge of a cliff, where the sea crashed below like an endless breath, there was said to be a sacred scroll. It was kept in a wooden box behind the altar, untouched for centuries. No monk had ever opened it. Yet the elders spoke of it with reverence. They said, "This scroll holds a teaching so clear, it does not need to be read. It reveals itself to those ready to understand." A young monk named Koji, curious and eager, became obsessed with the scroll. He believed it held a powerful secreton that could bring him awakening. While others swept the halls or served tea, Koji studied old records, meditated beside the altar, and even dreamed of the box. He whispered to the scroll when no one was listening, "Please, show me." After many seasons, the old abbot called him one evening and said, "If you must see the scroll, you may open the box tomorrow at sunrise. But remember, some teachings are not written in ink." That night, Koji could not sleep. He waited through the dark, heart pounding, rehearsing what might be inside. As the first light spilled through the temple windows, he approached the altar. The box creaked as he opened it. Inside was the scroll, tied with faded silk. He unrolled it slowly. His eyes widened. There was nothing written on it, not a single mark, just an empty sheet of parchment. At first, Koji felt his chest tighten. "Is this a joke?" he thought. But then something inside him paused. His hands trembled, not with anger, but with sudden understanding. He realized the scroll was not there to be read. It was there to be seen. It was silent, but not empty. Its quiet surface reflected his own mind, restless, searching, never still. And now, in the stillness, he understood what no ink could say. The scroll didn't need to speak. It was speaking already. From that day, Koji changed. He stopped chasing hidden meanings. He bowed more often. He smiled more gently. And when others asked about the scroll, he only said, "It read me, not the other way around." Moral of the story: not all wisdom is written. Some truths speak without words, and some scrolls carry no message but presence. Detachment means letting go of the need to understand everything with the mind. Sometimes, when we stop trying to read life, it begins to read us. The next story is called The Sound of One Leaf Falling Upward. In a quiet village surrounded by mountains, there lived a young monk named Akeno who struggled with restlessness. He was diligent in his practice, but his thoughts constantly chased after meaning. Every sutra he read only led to more questions. Every silence he sat in felt heavy with waiting. He longed for some clear sign, a moment of revelation that would show him what enlightenment truly meant. One autumn, the temple was covered in golden leaves. The trees let go of their beauty without effort. The monks raked them each morning, but still the leaves came, soft as breath. Akeno began spending his free hours beneath the largest maple, hoping the falling leaves would whisper something into his heart. One day, he approached the abbot, a gentle old man named Renshu, and asked, "Master, what does awakening feel like? What sound does truth make?" Renshu only smiled and said, "When the time is right, you will hear the sound of one leaf falling upward." Akeno blinked. "But leaves only fall down." Renshu bowed and walked away. Confused but curious, Akeno sat under the maple every day. He watched the leaves fall, dozens, hundreds, thousands, always downward. Time passed. The mountain air grew colder. Most trees had gone bare. Still, Akeno waited for the one leaf that would rise. One dawn, as a pale fog hugged the ground, he sat once again beneath the tree. A single leaf detached and fluttered gently. It spiraled, caught a breath of wind, and for a brief moment it lifted. Not much, not far, but just enough. It rose. It made no sound, but in Akeno's heart something rang clear, not like a bell but like a silence that had been waiting to be heard. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He only breathed. At that moment he understood. Enlightenment wasn't loud, dramatic, or grand. It was subtle, quiet, like a leaf that, for no reason at all, moved in a direction no one expected. Moral of the story: true realization comes not through force, but surrender. Detachment is not about resisting the fall, but accepting it so fully that you rise. In rare moments of stillness, the impossible becomes possible, no because we chase it, but because we stop. Sometimes the loudest truths arrive in the softest way, like the sound of one leaf falling upward. The next story is called "He Meditated Until the Floor Disappeared." At the edge of a snowy plateau stood a forgotten temple carved into the mountainside. The winters were long, and silence hung thick in the air like smoke. It was here that a monk named Daigo chose to sit for 100 days in unbroken meditation. He was neither young nor oldenly determined. He had grown tired of teachings, tired of chasing words. He no longer wanted understanding. He only wanted to sit. On the first day, the cold bit into his bones, and his legs ached. His thoughts came like waves, memories, fears, hunger, pride. But he did not move. He watched them come and go like wind through grass. By the second week, he no longer felt time pass. He heard the creak of snow melting from the roof. He heard the mice beneath the walls. He even heard his own heartbeat echo like a drum inside his ribs. Still, he sat. Weeks turned to months. His body thinned. His hair grew long and uncombed. Visitors came and left, unsure if he even noticed them. Some monks whispered that he had gone mad. Others said he had entered a different realm of seeing. Then one day, something strange happened. As the light from the window spilled across the floor where he sat, Daigo opened his eyes and the floor was gone. It hadn't collapsed. It hadn't broken. It was simply no longer there. He saw nothing beneath him. No wood, no cracks, no shadow. He was sitting in air, supported by nothing, yet falling nowhere. He felt neither fear nor joy. He simply sat. When another monk finally approached him and asked what had happened, Daigo did not answer. He only pointed downward. But when the monk looked, the floor was perfectly intact. Daigo smiled, then closed his eyes again. He had not escaped the world. He had only dropped through it, through all the layers of belief and illusion, the idea of ground, of self, of holding on. They had vanished. He was not sitting on anything, he was simply being. Moral of the story: detachment is not floating above life, it is falling so deeply into stillness that nothing remains to hold on to. When the mind stops building floors to stand on labels, identities, expectations, truth reveals itself as boundless space. And in that space, we are not supported, we are free. The next story is called The Monk Who Drew Water with a Sieve. At a monastery nestled beside a dry riverbed, there lived a young monk named Haru. He was devoted, sincere, and eager to reach enlightenment. He rose before dawn, studied the sutras, and worked tirelessly in silence. But despite all his effort, he felt no closer to peace. His thoughts ran wild. His heart remained heavy. He longed for clarity, but the more he reached for it, the farther it seemed to drift. One hot afternoon, the head monk gave him a strange task. "Take this sieve," he said, handing Haru a fine woven basket of bamboo, "and bring water from the well to fill the basin in the meditation hall." Haru blinked. "But master, the sieve will not hold water." The head monk only smiled and walked away. Still obedient, Haru went to the well. He dipped the sieve in and rushed toward the hall, but by the time he arrived, the water had vanished. Not a drop remained. He tried again and again. Dozens of times. Water in water, out emptiness every time. Other monks watched in silence. Some whispered, some shook their heads, but Haru said nothing. He only returned to the well, again and again. As the sun lowered and his arms ached, something changed. He stopped hurrying. He stopped resisting. His movements softened. He stopped trying to succeed and simply allowed the act to unfold. Sieve in, water out. Breathe in, let go. Late in the evening, the head monk returned. The basin remained empty. Haru bowed his head. "I have failed," he said softly. The task was impossible. The old monk looked at the sieve and smiled. "Look closely." Haru raised it, and for the first time, he noticed something. The sieve, once dry and dusty, was now clean. The bamboo shimmered in the last light of the day, worn smooth by flowing water. The master nodded. "You were never meant to hold the water. You were meant to be changed by it." Tears filled Haru's eyes. The lesson struck deep. Moral of the story: detachment is not about grasping or achieving, it's about allowing life to pass through you without resistance. Just like water through a sieve, peace cannot be held, only received. And in that quiet receiving, something within us is slowly washed clean. The path may not fill the bowl, but it purifies the one who walks it. The next story is called The Cat Who Answered the Koan. In a quiet temple near Kyoto, where cherry blossoms fell like snow in spring, there lived a cat named Tama. She was small and white, with piercing blue eyes, and she wandered the halls freely. The monks never tried to control her. She came and went as she pleased, often curling up beside meditating students or disappearing for days into the woods. One evening, the head monk, Master Ryo, gave a difficult koan to the students. "If a sound is not heard, does it still echo? If a thought is not held, does it still exist?" The students struggled. They debated through the night, quoting scriptures, offering metaphors, trying to outthink one another. One said, "An unspoken sound is like a wave unbroken." Another argued, "A thought that passes without grasp is not real." But every answer felt like smoke, brief, clever, and empty. As the morning light crept into the meditation hall, Tama the cat strolled in. She sat in the middle of the room, stretched, yawned, and then lay down on Master Ryo's cushion without hesitation. The room went silent. No one dared move. Master Ryo smiled and said, "There is your answer." The students were puzzled. "But Master," she didn't say anything. Rio replied, "Exactly." He then explained. Tama did not debate the sound. She did not cling to the thought. She simply was. She heard the koan, felt no need to respond, and rested in its silence. That is understanding without the need to explain. The students bowed. Some wept, not because they had solved the koan, but because they finally realized it didn't need solving. That afternoon, Tama slept in the sun, unmoved by her newfound fame. Moral of the story: wisdom doesn't always speak, it often rests. Detachment is not about finding the right answer, but about letting go of the need to answer at all. Some questions open the door not to solutions, but to stillness. In that stillness, a cat may understand more than the cleverest mind. The next story is called The Rice Bowl That Rejected Rice. In a small temple deep in the valleys of old Kyoto, meals were served in silence. Each monk carried one item, a simple wooden rice bowl, polished by years of use. It was said that how a monk treated his bowl revealed the state of his mind. Some handled theirs with care, others with hurry, but none were as strange as the bowl of a monk named Senzu. Senzu was quiet, always present for every meditation, every chore, every chant. But when mealtime came, something curious happened. Each time rice was served into his bowl, the grains would scatter. As if the bowl repelled them, the rice would fall to the mat, untouched. The cook tried again and again, but the rice never stayed. Others began to murmur. Was it a trick? A sign? A punishment? One day, the head monk called Senzu forward. "Why does your bowl reject the rice?" he asked. Senzu bowed deeply. "Because I have not yet learned how to receive," he said. The hall fell silent. He explained softly, "I came here thinking I must be worthy before I accept anything. I judged myself too harshly. I thought if I emptied myself enough, I would be ready. But instead, I've become hollow not in peace, but in shame. My bowl reflects my heart. It cannot hold what I still resist." The head monk walked to him and gently took the bowl. He turned it over. Inside was a small crack barely visible right at the center. The rice had not been rejected. It had been falling through. The master placed a hand on Senzu's shoulder. Some bowls do not need to be thrown away. They need to be healed. That night, the master filled the crack with gold resina, quiet practice once used by potters to honor brokenness, not hide it. The next morning, the rice stayed. Senzu wept as he ate, slowly, gratefully. Moral of the story: detachment is not emptiness. From rejection, it is emptiness that can receive. Many of us carry silent cracks inside, not from failure, but from forgetting we are worthy. Healing begins when we stop trying to be perfect and start letting life feed us again. Even a broken bowl, when mended with care, can hold nourishment and even shine. The next story is called A Cloud That Pointed the Way. Far in the mountains of Bhutan, there was a Zen hermit named Lian who had not spoken to another soul in nearly 10 years. His days were simple: gathering wood, fetching water, sitting in stillness. He had come to the mountains, searching for clarity, for the answer to a question that had haunted him since he was a boy. What is my path? He had tried many monasteries, teachings, pilgrimages, and still a quiet ache remained. So he chose silence. He believed that in quiet isolation, the path would finally reveal itself. But even in silence, doubt persisted. Some mornings he would stare into the valley below and feel lost, like a leaf waiting for wind. One day, as he climbed to the top of a nearby ridge to collect firewood, he looked up and saw a single cloud drifting across the sky. It wasn't large or stormy. It didn't glow. It was just a soft, low cloud, moving slowly. But there was something in the way it moved, gentle, certain, without hurry. He sat on a stone and watched it. For hours. It didn't stop to explain. It didn't pause to be seen. It simply moved with the wind, unbothered by direction or destination. It passed over trees, valleys, and cliffs, changing shape, but never resisting. As it disappeared behind a peak, Lian suddenly felt the ache inside him loosen. The question in his heart, "What is my path?" no longer needed an answer, because now he saw. The path was not something to find. It was something to live. Like the cloud, he too was already moving. The stillness, the doubt, the silence, it had all been part of the way. He smiled for the first time in years. That night, he lit a small fire, boiled water for tea, and whispered for the first time in a decade, "Thank you." Moral of the story. Sometimes guidance doesn't come as a voice, it comes as movement. A cloud does not know where it's going, yet it never stops. Detachment is not the end of seeking, but the release of needing to arrive. When we stop demanding answers, even the sky can point the way. The next story is called The Monk Who Asked the Moon to Preach. In the upper hills of a coastal province, where clouds kissed the mountaintops and the night smelled of pine, a solitary monk named Aisho lived in a tiny hermitage. He was known for speaking little, but thinking much. His mind was a storm of questions that never rested about life, death, the void, and the nature of enlightenment. One evening, under a wide autumn sky, Aisho sat by the edge of a cliff, staring up at the moon. It hung like a lantern in the darkness, full and silver, casting soft shadows on the rocks around him. In a voice barely louder than a whisper, Aisho said, "Why does no one give me a straight answer?" He remembered all the koans he had heard, the riddles, the paradoxes. Every master he had visited gave him silence or questions in return. His mind grew weary. His heart longed for one clear, truth simple, final. So that night, in both reverence and exhaustion, he lifted his face toward the sky and whispered, "If no teacher will speak plainly, then let the moon preach to me." The wind grew still. The world seemed to pause. And then nothing happened. The moon stayed silent. No voice, no sign, just the soft glow over the land. But Aisho didn't look away. He kept watching, breath slowing. The longer he gazed, the more his mind loosened. The questions so loud just moments before began to dissolve. Not because they were answered, but because they no longer needed to be. He noticed the way the moonlight touched everything without choosing. The stones, the weeds, his own handsaw equally lit. It asked nothing. It explained nothing. Yet it was complete. For the first time, he felt full. Not with knowledge, but with stillness. He bowed to the moon, not out of superstition, but gratitude. And then, for the first time in many years, he laughed. Not at a joke, not at himself, but at the beautiful mystery of it all. Moral of the story. Sometimes, the greatest teachings come not through words, but through presence. Detachment is not giving up the search, it is realizing the search itself was noise. When we stop demanding answers, the world begins to glow. Like the moon, truth does not explain it, simply shines. The next story is called The Student Who Burned the Sutras Before Reading. In a remote region of Tibet, there lived a young student named Tenpa, who had spent years preparing to receive the sacred sutras. His teacher, an old and wise monk named Dorje, had promised him that when the time was right, he would be given the temple's oldest and most treasured scroll texts passed down through generations, written in delicate ink on worn parchment. Tenpa had waited for this day like one waits for spring after a long winter. He dreamed of reading the ancient wisdom, of finally understanding what his heart had yearned for. He imagined reciting passages in meditation, using them to unlock enlightenment. Finally, on a cold morning, Dorje led him into the temple's inner chamber. From a locked wooden chest, he lifted a bundle of sutras wrapped in faded cloth. Without speaking, he placed them into Tenpa's hands. Tenpa bowed low, eyes filled with awe. But before he could unroll the first scroll, Dorje lit a match and handed it to him. "Burn them," the teacher said. Tenpa froze. His hands trembled. "But Master," he whispered, "these are the teachings, the path. How can I destroy them before I even know what they say?" Dorje looked at him gently and replied, "If you believe truth lives only in ink, you will never find it. Burn them, then look inside and see if anything was ever lost." With tears in his eyes, Tenpa lit the flame. Slowly, the sutras turned to smoke. As the final ash drifted into the wind, Tenpa felt a strange lightness. Not joy, not sorrow, just release. He sat in silence for a long time, expecting pain, expecting regret. But none came. Instead, he felt a quiet truth bloom in him, not from words, but from surrender. In the weeks that followed, his practice deepened, not because he knew more, but because he needed to know less. He listened more deeply, breathed more fully, and smiled more freely. The teachings, it seemed, had entered him without a single word. Moral of the story: the truth is not trapped in paper, nor held by form. Detachment means trusting that wisdom cannot be lostly uncovered. Sometimes the clearest path begins when we let go of even the things we think we need most. When we stop clinging to the teachings begin to live through us. The next story is called "The Rock That Floated for a Second." In a quiet village near the sea, there was a Zen monastery built from stone and salt-worn wood. Among the students training, there was a young monk named Jiro. He was strong in body and sharp in mind, but troubled in spirit. He wanted to attain enlightenment more than anything, and his desire clung to him like wet clothes. He read every teaching, memorized every sutra, and meditated harder than anyone else. But no matter how much effort he gave, his heart felt heavy. Enlightenment seemed like a distant mountain, always receding as he ran. One day, after another long, silent retreat, the head monk took Jiro to a wide river behind the temple. He handed Jiro a large, smooth rock, cold, heavy, and solid. "Throw it into the river," the master said. Jiro obeyed. The rock splashed and sank instantly. "Now," the master said calmly, "make it float." Jiro stared at him, puzzled. "But master, it's a rock." "Yes," the monk replied, "and so is the self you carry." Jiro returned to that river every day after that. He stared at the water. He thought about effort, about control, about trying. Some days he hurled rocks with frustration. Other days, he simply sat in silence beside the water. One morning, after a deep night of restless dreams, he picked up another stone. But this time, something inside him was different. He didn't throw it. He didn't grip it with tension. He simply opened his hand and let it fall from his palm. It slipped into the water gently, and for just a breath, it floated. Not in defiance of nature, but as if it had been accepted by it. Then it sank. Jiro blinked. Something broke loose in his chest. Not pain, not joy, just space. He smiled. The master, standing behind him, whispered, "For 1 second, you stopped trying to make it float. That was enough." Moral of the story: true detachment is not letting go of the world, it's letting go of the need to control it. The harder we try to rise, the heavier we become. But when we release the struggle, even the heaviest parts of us can float for just long enough to show us what freedom feels like. The next story is called "The Gate That Opened Inward Forever." In the heart of an ancient Zen monastery built into the side of a mountain, there was a gate unlike any other. It stood at the center of the temple ground stall, wooden, carved with symbols that no one could fully translate. What made the gate unique was that it had no latch, no hinges, and no handle. Yet the elders called it the Gate of Return. Young monks often asked about it. Where does it lead? What lies beyond it? But the old monks would only smile and say, "You will see it open when you are no longer trying to leave." Among the students was a seeker named Riku, full of fire and restlessness. He practiced harder than anyone. He wanted breakthrough, transformation, enlightenment. Every day he passed the gate, wondering if today it would open. He knocked once, he knocked twice. Sometimes, in frustration, he pressed his forehead to it, whispering prayers for it to unlock. Nothing ever happened. One morning, after yet another sleepless night filled with questions and doubt, Riku sat beside the gate and wept. Not loudly, not with anger, just a soft weeping that comes when striving finally breaks. He whispered, "I've tried everything. I've read, meditated, fasted, begged. What more can I do?" A breeze moved through the trees. The morning light shifted, and in that moment of giving up, not from failure, but from softness, he felt something shift. He stood up and placed his hand on the wood, not with effort, but with presence. The gate, without sound, began to open, not outward, but inward. But as it opened, there was no other side, no new place, no hidden garden. The space behind the gate was the same ground he stood on. Only now it felt different. It felt vast, still, free. He stood in silence for a long time. The gate had not led him away. It had led him into himself. From that day on, Riku stopped trying to reach anything beyond. He swept the floor with full attention. He walked slowly. He laughed gently. And whenever he passed the gate, he would bow not to what it opened to, but to what it had opened within. Moral of the story: the deepest transformations are not outward journeys, but inner shifts. Detachment means turning inward, not as escape, but as return. The gate to freedom does not lead elsewhere, it opens in the heart. And once it opens, it never truly closes again. The next story is called "He Bowed to an Empty Mat for 30 Years." In a quiet temple surrounded by rice fields and cicada song, there was an old monk named Tenga. He was not famous. He had no disciples. He gave no Dharma talks. Yet every morning, just before the sun rose, he would enter the meditation hall, light a stick of incense, and bow deeply to an empty woven mat at the front of the room. He did this without fail for 30 years. New monks came and went. Some wondered who the mat was for. Perhaps a great teacher once sat there, they guessed. Others whispered, "Maybe he's bowing to a ghost," but no one dared ask Tenga. There was a dignity in his silence that made even the most curious hold their tongue. One winter, a young novice named Ray arrived eager, bright-eyed, and always full of questions. He watched Tenga's morning ritual with deep curiosity. Finally, after months of quiet observation, he approached the old monk. "Master," Ray asked gently, "why do you bow to an empty mat?" Tenga looked at him for a long time. His eyes were soft, his smile small. "At first," he said, "I bowed to my teacher who once sat there. He left long ago, but I continued." Ray nodded, expecting that answer, but Tenga continued. "Then I bowed to the idea of the Buddha, then to the Dharma, then to the truth beyond words." He paused, then looked toward the mat. "But now," he whispered, "I bow to nothing, not in worship, not in hope, only in presence." Ray stood silent. Tenga placed a hand on his shoulder. "I bow because bowing is enough, because something in me softens when I lower my head. There is no one there. And finally, that is enough." From that day forward, Ray never questioned the empty mat again. Moral of the story: detachment is the quiet release of needing meaning in every act. We search for purpose, for reward, for someone to witness our devotion. But sometimes the deepest reverence is offered to nothing at all. In bowing without expectation, We return to the purest form of humility, and in that, we are transformed. The next story is called The Monk Who Spoke to a Dying Tree. In a remote temple nestled between hills, where the earth was dry and the sun unforgiving, there stood an old tree at the edge of the monastery garden. Its bark had begun to crack, its branches sagged, and its leaves had turned pale. Many monks believed it would soon die. Most walked past it without a second glance. But one monk, named Ima, stopped every day to sit beneath it. She was quiet, young, and often unnoticed. She never quoted sutras aloud or sought favor from elders. But she had a habit that puzzled the others. She whispered to the dying tree. Every morning, she would bring a small bowl of water and pour it gently at the tree's base. Then she'd sit and speak to it softly. No one knew what she said. One afternoon, a senior monk finally asked, "Why do you spend your time with something that is fading? The tree cannot be saved." Ima smiled. "I'm not trying to save it," she replied. "I'm just keeping it company." The others didn't understand. Seasons passed. The tree continued to dry, its bark peeling like paper. Yet Ima never stopped her visits. She would sometimes touch its trunk with both hands and say nothing at all. And though the tree remained withered, something about its presence began to change. Birds began to nest in its hollows. Wind made soft music through its empty limbs. Even the dying began to seem sacred. One night, the abbot joined Ima beneath the tree. After a long silence, he said, "What has it taught you?" Ima looked up and said that even when something is fading, it still gives. "This tree has taught me how to be alive without holding on. It gives shade, music, and stillness, even as it lets go." The tree did eventually die. It fell one morning with no sound, but the ground where it stood became a place where monks now go to sit in quiet. They say it still feels alive. Moral of the story: not everything that fades is lost. Detachment means honoring what is passing without needing to keep it. Even in its final breath, life continues to teach. Like the dying tree, we can still offer beauty, even as we let go. Letting go doesn't mean the end, it means becoming part of everything. The next story is called The One Who Chanted Silence. In a windswept monastery carved into the cliffs above the sea, the monks chanted every morning before sunrise. Their voices echoed through the stone halls, deep, rhythmic, and strong. The chants were a discipline, a devotion, and a way to still the mind. Every monk had a voice in the chorus, except one. His name was Koji. He never spoke, never sang, not because he could not, but because he chose not to. From the moment he arrived at the temple as a young man, he entered every chant session, stood with the others, opened his mouth, and remained silent. Some thought him disobedient, others thought him strange, but Koji never missed a single chant. He was always present, always still. One day, a new monk, impatient and full of fire, turned to the abbot and asked, "Why do you allow him to stay? He does not chant. He disrespects the practice." The abbot said nothing. That evening, he invited all the monks to gather beneath the cliff at dusk, where the wind met the ocean. The abbot asked Koji to stand alone in front of them. Then he turned to the others and said, "Listen." They stood in silence. At first, there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the crashing of waves. Then, slowly, they heard something else so subtle it could have been imagined. It was Koji, not singing, not speaking, but being. He stood in total stillness, yet his presence filled the space. His breath matched the rhythm of the sea. His silence was not empty, was full. It drew the monks inward. One by one, their thoughts quieted. The need for sound fell away. The abbot turned to the young monk and said, "Some chant to silence their thoughts." Koji silenced his thoughts and became the chant. The next morning, when the bells rang for the daily chant, No one noticed Koji's voice missing. His silence was now part of the song. Moral of the story: detachment is not the absence of devotion, it is the absence of self in devotion. When the ego falls away, even silence becomes music. To chant is not always to speak. Sometimes, the purest offering is presence without noise, and in that quiet, truth sings loudest. The next story is called The Master Who Gave a Koan with No Words, No Form. In a wind-swept temple carved into a cliffside, there lived a master named Orita, who had long ceased using words. He no longer gave lectures, he no longer answered questions, and yet students traveled for miles just to sit near him, hoping somehow to understand. They had heard stories that he once delivered a teaching so clear it ended a student's suffering in a single glance, but no one could describe what had happened. Orita no longer wrote, spoke, or gestured. He simply was. A young monk named Soma arrived one spring, full of discipline and doubt. He had studied under many teachers, memorized volumes of sutras, and still felt far from any peace. "I need one true koan," he said, "one that will tear through everything false." The other monks pointed him to Master Orita. Soma approached the master with his head bowed, his heart racing. He whispered, "Please, give me a koan." The master looked at him. Nothing in his expression changed. He made no sound. He raised no hand. He did not blink. Soma waited. A moment passed, then another. Stillness stretched out like the horizon. The silence grew so loud it seemed to fill the room. The young monk grew restless. "Master, I need something. A phrase, a puzzle, a riddle, anything." Still nothing. Frustrated, Soma returned to his room. But something strange began to happen. The silence wouldn't leave him. It followed him like a shadow. At night, he dreamed not of words, but of empty space. In meditation, his mind repeated no question, only stillness. Days turned to weeks. Soma stopped trying to understand. He began to sit just like Orita, quiet, unmoving, without seeking. One day, while sweeping fallen petals in the courtyard, he felt a deep warmth bloom in his chest, like a breath he had been holding his whole life finally exhaled. There was no insight, no explosion, only space. He returned to the master, bowed, and whispered, "I understand." Orita looked at him and nodded. Moral of the story: the deepest koans are not puzzles to solve. They are mirrors held to the noise within us. Detachment is not escaping thought, but seeing that truth needs no shape, no sound, no answer. When we no longer search for form, we meet what cannot be broken, named, or lost. Sometimes, the loudest teaching is nothing at all. The next story is called He Trained by Watching Ice Melt. In the far north, where the winters seemed to last forever, there lived a wandering monk named Natsu. He arrived at a remote Zen hermitage just as the rivers froze and snow buried the paths. The resident monks welcomed him kindly, but when asked what practice he wished to take up, Natsu made an unusual request. "I want to train in patience," he said softly. "Not through chanting, not through scriptures, but by watching ice melt." The monks were puzzled. Some laughed. One even asked, "Why not choose fire instead?" But the abbot, an old man with eyes like moonlight, simply nodded. "Then you may sit by the frozen pond," he said. "It will teach you, if you can wait long enough to hear it." Each day, Natsu sat by the edge of the icy water, wrapped in silence. He did not bring books. He did not ask questions. He only watched. The thick layer of ice shimmered like glass, unmoving. His breath rose in clouds. His feet ached from the cold. Time passed slowly, and nothing seemed to change. At first he struggled. Thoughts pulled at him. "I'm wasting time. Nothing is happening. Shouldn't I be doing more?" But still, he stayed. Days turned to weeks. The snow began to shrink. The sun stretched longer in the sky. And one morning, something shifted. A single drop of water slipped down the edge of the ice. Then another. The rigid surface began to thin, not with drama but with grace. The ice didn't fight. It didn't resist. It simply let go when the time came. Natsu felt his chest loosen as if something inside had also begun to thaw. He realized then he had not been waiting for the ice to melt. The ice had been waiting for him to soften. When spring arrived and the pond rippled once more, Natsu bowed to it and smiled. He had learned what no words could teach. Moral of the story: detachment is not about speed, effort, or control. It is about surrender. Like ice under sunlight, the hardest parts of us do not change by force, but by warmth. Transformation does not shout. It melts, quietly, slowly. And when we stop pushing, the soul begins to drip open, one drop at a time. The next story is called The Bell That Sang After It Cracked. In a fog-covered village at the foot of the mountains, there was a temple with a great bronze bell. Forged generations ago, it had rung at sunrise every day without fail, sending a deep, calming tone through the valley. People said the bell could still the heart, quiet the mind, and call lost souls home. The monk assigned to ring it, an elderly man named Genji, treated the bell like a living thing. He cleaned it, bowed to it, and struck it with reverence. "A sound like this," he once whispered, "does not come from metal. It comes from the silence behind it." But one winter, during a fierce storm, lightning struck the bell tower. The beam above cracked and gave way. The bell fell hard to the stone floor. When Genji and the other monks arrived, they found a deep fracture running through its side. The younger monks were devastated. "It's ruined," they said. "Its voice is lost." They covered it with cloth and began making plans to replace it. But Genji did not speak. He simply waited. One morning, weeks later, as mist rolled through the temple grounds, he uncovered the bell. With quiet breath, he lifted the old striker and gently tapped the side. The sound that came was no longer perfect. It wavered, it trembled, but it was hauntingly beautiful. It didn't rise like it once had. Instead, it shivered through the air like a memory, fragile, aching, and impossibly human. Monks gathered in silence. No one said a word. Tears slipped down one novice's cheek. From that day on, the cracked bell was rung each morning. It no longer spoke with strength, but with soul. Its imperfection revealed something no flawless sound ever had, truth that had endured. One monk later asked Genji, "Why did you keep ringing it?" He smiled. "Because it didn't stop singing. It just began singing differently." Moral of the story: detachment does not mean becoming unbreakable. It means learning to sing after the break. True beauty is not in perfection, but in presence that continues, even through cracks. When we accept our fractures, we stop hiding and start resonating. What is broken still belongs. What trembles can still echo. The next story is called The Cloud Who Carried a Message. Long ago, in a valley surrounded by green hills and drifting mists, there lived a small Zen community that valued stillness above all things. Among them was a monk named Sho, known for being thoughtful but distant. He was always searching for answers, reading, meditating, asking questions no one could fully answer. "Where does the self go when we let go of it?" he once asked his master. The master only pointed to the sky. "Ask the clouds." Sho began watching the sky each day. At dawn, at noon, at dusk, would sit alone, eyes tilted upward. He watched clouds gather, stretch, dissolve. Sometimes they were heavy and dark, other times soft as silk. He kept hoping one of them might bring him a sign. One morning, after days of rain, The clouds parted. A single bright white cloud drifted low above the temple gardens. Shou's breath caught, something in him stilled. That cloud moved unlike the others, slowly, as if pausing with purpose. It hovered above the cherry trees, then turned not with wind, but as if it knew. Shou stood, heart racing, and followed. He walked beyond the temple, across the stone bridge, through the rice fields. The cloud floated just ahead, always visible, always just far enough. Finally, on a quiet hill, it stopped. Shou stood beneath it, exhausted. "What message do you carry?" he whispered. The cloud shimmered in the sunlight, casting no shadow. There was no voice, no thunder, no sign. And yet, Shou understood. The message wasn't spoken. It wasn't written. It was the cloud itself, always moving, always changing, never grasping, never staying. Tears welled in Shou's eyes, not from sadness, but relief. For the first time, he stopped asking. He didn't need to understand anymore. He just stood there, present, like the cloud. When he returned to the temple, he said nothing. But those who saw him noticed. He no longer looked like someone searching. He had become part of the sky. Moral of the story: detachment does not mean drifting without meaning. It means moving through life like a cloud, light, open, free. The answers we seek often do not arrive in words, but in quiet forms. When we stop clinging to understanding, we discover that the message has always been the moment itself. The next story is called The Cone That Was Found on a Spiderweb. In a small forest temple where morning dew dripped from cedar leaves, there lived a monk named Natsu. He was young but quiet, and unlike the others, he did not rush to seek enlightenment. He walked slowly, listened carefully, and often wandered alone through the gardens after dawn. One morning, as sunlight broke gently through the trees, Natsu noticed something delicate between two branches, a single thread of a spiderweb, trembling with light. As he stepped closer, he saw the full web, finely woven and wet with dew, shining like silver thread stitched into the air. But something stopped him. At the center of the web was a strange shape. A small leaf had fallen into it and stuck, but not completely. It hovered, caught in the silk, spinning gently in the breeze. On the leaf, written in faint strokes of mud or perhaps soot, were two strange character zones he did not recognize. They weren't from any sutra or scripture. They seemed like nonsense. Yet he could not look away. He stood there for what felt like hours, watching the web hold the leaf as the sun warmed the garden. He didn't understand the meaning of the marks, but something deeper than understanding stirred within him. For days, Natsu returned to the same spot. The leaf never moved, the web never broke. One morning, he bowed before it. The abbot noticed and asked, "What are you bowing to, young one?" Natsu replied, "A koan that no one gave me." He never told anyone what he had seen, but from that day forward, his practice changed. He no longer sought answers in scrolls or waited for the perfect teaching. He walked through the world as if every thread, every whisper, every passing shadow might be a hidden lesson that asked nothing but stillness in return. Years later, someone asked him if he had ever solved that silent riddle. Natsu smiled and said, "No, I let it solve me." Moral of the story: not every koan is spoken. Some arrive quietly, without form, written in the breath of a moment. Detachment is trusting that truth may come without explanation. When the mind stops needing to know, it begins to see. And sometimes, a spider's web holds more dharma than 100 sutras. The next story is called The Master Who Took a Nap During Enlightenment. In a quiet mountain temple tucked behind waterfalls and pines, there lived a Zen master named Anzu. He was respected, but not in the way most masters were. He did not speak in riddles. He didn't carry a staff or raise his voice. Instead, he was often found lying in the garden, watching clouds drift or napping beneath a tree. Many young monks found this strange. They expected more fire, intensity, profound lectures. But Anzu only smiled, offered tea, and returned to his cushion, or his nap. One afternoon, a passionate student named Ren approached him. Ren had just returned from a 3-month retreat in the mountains, where he had fasted, meditated for endless hours, and even stood in freezing rivers to awaken his senses. "Master," Ren said, breathless, "I am close. I've touched the edge of awakening, but I need your guidance to cross. Please, teach me the final step." Anzu yawned and stretched beneath the plum tree. He patted the grass beside him. "Sit then." Ren sat, stiff and upright, while Anzu laid down again and closed his eyes. Silence fell between them. The wind rustled the leaves. Birds called in the distance. After a few minutes, Ren shifted. "Master, are you sleeping?" Anzu spoke without opening his eyes. "Maybe. Maybe not." Ren frowned. "But this is serious. I need to know. I'm so close." Anzu opened one eye and said, "Then sleep." Confused, Ren stayed quiet. Minutes passed, then an hour. The sunlight grew warmer, and something in Ren began to soften. He stopped sitting so straight. He lay back in the grass. His breath slowed. Without realizing, he drifted into sleep. When he awoke, the sky had shifted, and Anzu was gone. But something felt different, lighter, as if a weight he'd carried his whole life had vanished in the nap. He laughed quietly at himself, at the trees, at the whole journey. He finally understood enlightenment wasn't found in effort, or pain, or proving worth. It was found in the moment when striving stopped. Moral of the story: true detachment is letting go of the idea that awakening must be hard, loud, or earned through suffering. Sometimes the deepest truths arrive not in effort, but in rest. When we stop reaching, we fall into what has always been here. Even a nap can be a doorway if the heart is open. The next story is called The Zafu That Vanished Mid-Meditation. In a temple known for its strict silence and deep discipline, there was a monk named Toma who was admired for his stillness. He never moved during meditation. He sat perfectly upright, like a statue carved from breath. Other monks looked to him as a model of control. His favorite zafu, a round black meditation cushion, was worn smooth by years of use. It had molded to the shape of his posture, a quiet symbol of his devotion. Toma treated it almost like a sacred object. He always placed it in the exact same spot and bowed to it before sitting. One morning, before dawn, Toma entered the meditation hall alone. He bowed, as usual, and sat in silence. The room was dark, the world still asleep. He followed his breath. In, out, in, out. But after some time, he couldn't tell how long, he noticed something strange. The sensation beneath him had changed. It was as if the cushion was gone. There was no weight, no contact, no support. He opened his eyes. The room was exactly the same, but when he looked down, his zafu had disappeared. Nothing but the smooth wooden floor beneath him. Yet he hadn't fallen. He hadn't shifted. He was still sitting, but on nothing at all. Panic rose in his chest, but only for a moment. Then something loosened. A deep stillness opened inside him. He kept sitting. Time dissolved. Thought dissolved. The idea of Toma, the idea of effort, even the idea of meditation gone. When the bell finally rang and the room filled with monks, Toma stood slowly. The cushion was back beneath him, worn, round, just as it had always been. He didn't speak of what happened. He only bowed, walked outside, and smiled at the sound of the wind through the trees. From that day on, his posture softened. He no longer tried to be perfect. He no longer feared movement, and still he was more present than ever. Moral of the story: detachment is not found in holding the form, it is found when form disappears, and we remain. When what we lean on vanishes and we don't fall, we learn the seat of peace was never beneath us. It was always within. The cushion does not hold the meditator, presence does. The next story is called The Candle That Refused to Burn Until Midnight. In a snow-covered temple hidden in a northern forest, the winter nights stretched long and cold. Each monk was given one small candle per evening, meant to last until their meditation was complete. The flame was a symbol of focus, of inner light against the dark. But one monk, named Sora, faced a strange problem. Every evening, no matter how carefully he tried, his candle would not burn. He would strike the match, light the wick, but the flame would flicker once, sputter, and vanish. The wax remained untouched. The candle refused to shine. He asked the other monks, but their candles all burned without trouble. He checked the room for wind, adjusted the placement, even tried lighting other candles, but it was always the same. His candle would not burn. Then, one night, just as he was about to give up, the temple bell rang midnight. At that exact moment, the candle flared to life sudden and strong. The room filled with light. Sora stared at the flame, confused but deeply still. The next night, he waited. He did not try to light the candle early. He simply sat in the darkness. He listened to the wind outside, the creak of the wood, the rhythm of his own breath. And at midnight, the candle lit again on its own. This went on for days. Finally, he went to the old abbot and asked, "Why does my candle only burn at midnight?" The abbot smiled, then whispered, "Because that is the hour when you finally stop trying." Sora said nothing. He understood. Midnight was the moment when all effort fell away. No more fixing, proving, forcing, only presence, only silence. From that night forward, he no longer waited for the candle. He simply embraced the dark, knowing the light would come no because he lit it, but because he allowed it. Moral of the story: detachment is not giving up, is the quiet surrender of control. The light we chase often appears only when we stop demanding it. When we release our grip on timing and trust the rhythm of things, what refuses to come begins to arrive, softly, precisely, like a flame at midnight. The next story is called The Monk Who Followed His Breath into a Wall. In a narrow Zen monastery nestled between two cliffs, there lived a monk named Renji, who was known for his fierce focus. He believed the breath was the gateway to enlightenment and practiced endlessly counting, feeling, following each inhale and exhale like it was the only thing keeping the universe from falling apart. Each morning, Renji would face the blank stone wall of the meditation hall and sit for hours, eyes half closed, spine straight, breath slow. Other monks admired his discipline but worried about his intensity. He refused meals if he felt distracted. He avoided conversation. "When I follow my breath perfectly," he said, "the wall will open." One winter morning, the air heavy with frost, Renji sat as usual, still as ice. He followed his breath deeper than he ever had. In, out, in, out. His awareness sharpened into a blade. Then, something strange happened. He no longer felt the cushion beneath him, no longer heard the wind beyond the hall. He followed his breath so deeply that it felt like he had entered it, moved through it. With every inhale, the wall in front of him faded. With every exhale, the world behind him dissolved. Then nothing, just breath. And then, suddenly impact. He gasped, his body jolted, his eyes flew open. He was nose to stone, forehead pressed against the wall. Somehow, without knowing it, he had leaned so far forward, so inward, that his body had collapsed into the very wall he had stared at for years. A dull ache throbbed in his head. but a strange laughter rose in his chest. Not mockery, not shame, just the gentle, absurd truth of it all. The wall hadn't opened, it never would, and yet somehow it already had. The next day, he returned to the meditation hall. But this time, he didn't try to break through anything. He simply sat, breathed, and let the wall be the wall. Moral of the story: sometimes the harder we try to pass through, the more we crash into what simply is. Detachment is not about breaking walls, it's about realizing there's nowhere else to go. The breath doesn't lead away from this moment, it leads directly into it. When we stop chasing, we stop colliding, and then even the wall begins to breathe. The next story is called The Silence That Answered Loudest. In a Zen monastery perched above the ocean cliffs, questions were welcomed like birds in spring. Students would ask the old master anything from the nature of the self to the taste of emptiness. And though the master answered when needed, it was his silences that echoed most. One day, a brilliant student named Akio arrived. He was praised for his sharp mind and clever tongue. He had studied all the sutras, mastered the rituals, and could recite the teachings backward and forward. But his heart was restless. He came before the master with urgency in his eyes. "I've understood everything," Akio said, "but I still feel no peace. Please, give me the final teaching." The master looked at him gently, then bowed and said, "Come with me." He led Akio to a rocky cliff where the sea crashed far below. The wind howled, the gulls cried overhead. The master sat on a stone and gestured for Akio to sit beside him. Akio waited. He expected a story, a riddle, a lesson. But the master said nothing. Minutes passed, then an hour. The wind wrapped around them, and still nothing. Not a word. Akio's thoughts raced. Was this the teaching? Was it a test? Frustration bubbled inside him. Then it softened. Slowly his mind began to quiet. The noise inside grew tired. Still, the master said nothing. The waves crashed. The wind shifted. The clouds moved slowly across the sky. And in that space where words had once lived, Akio felt something open, not like understanding, but like stillness that finally had room to breathe. Tears formed in his eyes. He wasn't sure why. The peace he'd begged for didn't arrive through logic. It came like a hush, like a hand gently covering his restless thoughts. After a long while, he turned to the master and bowed. "I understand now," he whispered. The master only smiled. Moral of the story: the deepest truths are not shouted, they are felt in the space between noise. Detachment is not the silence of emptiness, but the silence that contains everything. When the mind stops demanding answers, life itself becomes the response. Sometimes, the loudest answer is no answer at all. The next story is called The Dream That Solved the Riddle. In a quiet temple surrounded by rice fields and mist, there was an ancient riddle carved into a stone near the entrance. No one knew who had written it. It had been there longer than any living monk could remember. The riddle read, "What moves when still and stills when moved?" Many had tried to solve it. Some said it referred to the wind, others to the mind, and some claimed it was a metaphor for karma or consciousness. But the riddle remained unanswered. It was said that those who solved it would not find praise or reward but peace. A young monk named Arata became obsessed with it. He was gentle in nature but driven in mind. He spent years studying the riddle, meditating on each word, asking every teacher he met. But no answer satisfied him. The harder he tried to solve it, the more elusive it became. One night, exhausted from endless questioning, Arata sat beneath a flowering plum tree and fell into a deep sleep. In the dream, he stood at the edge of a vast, still lake. The surface was perfectly smooth, mirroring the moon and stars above. As he leaned closer, a single tear from his eye dropped into the water, not from sorrow, but from stillness. The ripple spread slowly. As it moved, the reflection of the moon disappeared. The lake, once still, was no longer whole. The dream whispered something not in words, but in feeling. Stillness can be broken by seeking. Motion can return to stillness by letting go. Arata awoke with tears still in his eyes. He walked to the stone riddle. For the first time, he didn't try to solve it. He simply sat beside it, breathing softly, a smile forming not because he had figured it out, but because he no longer needed to. That morning, a small blossom from the plum tree fell and landed beside him. It didn't make a sound, but in his heart it rang like a bell. Moral of the story: some riddles cannot be answered by force. Detachment is when the mind stops chasing and begins to feel. Peace comes not from solving the mystery, but from becoming quiet enough to let it speak. When the dream ends and the search fades, what we sought gently arrives and asks for nothing. The next story is called The Student Who Learned from an Ant's Pause. In a humble temple nestled beside terraced fields, there lived a student monk named Daiki. He was young, eager, and constantly in motion. His robes were always fluttering as he ran from task to task, sweeping, bowing, studying, always asking, "What's next?" He admired the senior monks who moved slowly, like clouds, and spoke only when needed. But no matter how hard Daiki tried to quiet his mind, something inside him always rushed. Even in meditation, he would peek at the bell, wondering how much time was left. One morning, after Daiki had spilled a pot of rice by hurrying through the kitchen, the abbot gave him no lecture. He simply handed him a small cushion and said, "Go sit in the garden until you see something worth bowing to." Daiki bowed and went. Hours passed. He watched the breeze in the trees, the koi in the pond, the monks walking silently. Still nothing felt worthy enough. He grew bored, restless. He wanted to be doing something. Then, just as he shifted on his cushion, he noticed a small ant crawling near his foot. It moved steadily across a rock, weaving past grains of sand. But then it stopped. It didn't move for several seconds, just stood there, still. Daiki stared. His breath slowed. In that tiny pause, the world around him softened. The birdsong faded into background. His thoughts thinned like mist. The ant wasn't tired. It wasn't lost. It was simply still, as if it had no need to rush, no fear of delay. And in that moment, neither did Daiki. Something gentle bloomed in his chestnut, a realization, but a release. For once, he had nowhere to go, nothing to fix, no next step. He bowed deeply to the ant. When he returned to the abbot, he didn't explain. He didn't need to. The abbot smiled, as if he already knew. Moral of the story: detachment is not always taught through great teachings. It often arrives through the tiniest stillness. In the pause of an ant, in the breath between thoughts, peace waits. When we stop rushing toward life, life comes to meet us. The most sacred moments may walk on 6 legs and carry no name. The next story is called The Footprint That Taught Emptiness. In the high desert where the wind wrote across sand dunes like brushstrokes on parchment, a Zen monk named Kisho lived in solitude. He walked barefoot each day along the same quiet path past rocks, scrub trees, and silent sky. His sandals had long been given away. "The earth teaches more than books," he once said. But Kisho was not seeking anything. He had given up the search years ago, not from failure, but from understanding. Now he simply walked. One morning, after a night of heavy wind, the path was completely smooth, wiped clean of every mark. The world felt new. As Kisho stepped onto the sand, he noticed something unusual. Each time his foot lifted, the print behind him slowly disappeared. Not because of wind, not because of others. It simply faded, as if the earth had chosen not to remember. He paused and watched. Step after step, the same thing happened. He left nothing behind. For a moment, his breath caught. Then, something opened inside him, soft, sharp, and vast. He realized, this is how everything moves. The sky does not keep the shape of birds. The sea does not hold the echo of ships. And the mind, too, must let each thought vanish before the next can come. Kisho knelt beside one of his fading prints. He touched the sand, not to stop the change, but to honor it. The emptiness left behind was not loss, it was truth. When he returned to the temple, another monk asked what he had learned on his walk. Kisho simply raised his foot, then set it down without a word. That night, he swept the meditation hall floor 3 times instead of once, not because it was dirty, but because something in him felt ready to be cleared. Moral of the story: emptiness is not avoided, is the gentle way the world releases what no longer needs to stay. Detachment is not erasing ourselves, but moving through life without needing to leave a mark. The most profound truths are those that do not cling. Like a footprint in sand, we are here, then gone, and that is beautiful. The next story is called The Garden That Grew Without Being Touched. On the outskirts of a Zen monastery hidden in a quiet forest, there was a garden that no one tended. It had no gate, no sign, and no assigned caretaker. Unlike the main courtyard, which was swept daily and pruned to perfection, this small patch of earth was left completely alone. Weeds grew freely, stones rested where they fell, and flowers bloomed in wild patterns. Most monks passed it by without notice, but a young monk named Toma found himself drawn to it. Something about its quiet chaos felt honest. One day, after completing his chores, Toma sat beside the untended garden. He watched the breeze move through the tall grass and the bees dance from bloom to bloom. There was no order, no plan, and yet nothing was missing. He returned the next day, and the next. It became his secret practice to change the garden, but to sit with it. Over time, he began to notice small details he would have missed before. How one flower opened slower than the others. How the moss climbed a stone like it was remembering an old path. How nothing hurried, yet everything moved. Other monks began to whisper. "Why does he waste time with the untended garden?" one asked. "He should be raking or memorizing sutras." But the abbot said nothing. One morning, after a heavy rain, Toma found the garden glowing with life. Drops clung to every blade of grass. A small bird bathed in a puddle. And in that simple stillness, he felt something bloom inside his chest. He saw that growth didn't always need shaping, that peace didn't always come from control. The garden wasn't wild, it was whole. Later that week, the abbot sat beside him and said, "You've learned what many never do." Toma bowed not in pride, but in awe. He had done nothing, yet everything had changed. Moral of the story: true detachment is not always about letting go of things, but letting go of the need to manage, fix, and control them. Some beauty grows best when left alone. Just like the heart, the soul blooms when given space, not pressure. The quiet garden teaches us presence is sometimes the only gardener we need. The next story is called The Stone That Knew the Answer. There was once a Zen student named Miro who had grown tired of words. He had studied every koan given to him, questioned every teacher he met, and yet the answers always led to more confusion. "Everything is a riddle," he said one day, frustrated. "Why can't the truth just speak clearly?" His master, an old monk with kind eyes and a quiet laugh, gave him a final instruction. "Go to the river outside the temple," he said, "and find a stone that knows the answer." Miro blinked. "How will I know which one?" "You'll know," the master replied. So Miro went. He wandered the riverbanks all day, picking up stones, round ones, sharp ones, stones shaped like hearts, others like teeth. He turned them over in his hands. listened for something, waited for some sign. None came. He sat down in exhaustion and sighed. His thoughts raced. This is nonsense. There is no answer. The stone is just a stone. In that moment, his hand reached into the shallow water and landed on a small, ordinary stone. It was smooth and cold, unremarkable in shape or color. But he paused. He did not ask it anything. He did not search for meaning. He just held it. And then it happened. He felt an immense stillness, not dramatic, not magical, just complete. For the first time, he didn't need an answer. The stone didn't speak, but something inside him became quiet. He felt the simplicity of the moment, no past, no future, no riddle. Just this: a hand, a stone, and peace. He brought the stone back to the temple and placed it silently on the altar. The master saw it and smiled. "You found it," he said, "but only because you stopped looking." Miro bowed, his eyes soft. Moral of the story: truth does not always speak, it waits. Detachment is not in giving up the question, but in giving up the need to be answered. Some stones speak not through sound, but through stillness. And when we listen with nothing left to ask, even the silent will teach. The next story is called The Koan Buried in a Rainstorm. There was a small Zen hermitage nestled between two mountains where monks practiced in silence through every season. Among them was a middle-aged monk named Shiro, known for his disciplined mind and intense focus. He had solved dozens of koans over the years, each one like a riddle meant to awaken insight. But one koan haunted him. Where does the rain go when the sky is empty? He meditated on it for months. He wrote it on paper, chanted it, dreamed of it, but no answer came. One evening, dark clouds gathered suddenly over the valley. The rain fell hard, fierce, endless, drowning the sound of thought. Thunder echoed through the hills. The roof leaked. The wind howled against the doors. The monks gathered inside, sitting shoulder to shoulder in meditation. But Shiro couldn't still his mind. The storm outside matched the storm inside. He grew agitated, restless. The koan echoed in him like a question with no language. Finally, unable to take it anymore, he stood and left the hall. He stepped barefoot into the cold storm, soaked within seconds. The rain hit him like needles. He kept walking past the temple, through the flooded path, into the forest. He collapsed beneath a tree, water dripping from his robes, hair in his eyes, breath ragged. And there he gave up, not out of failure, but of surrender. He no longer wanted the answer. He no longer needed to solve anything. He simply lay there, letting the rain soak into him, through him, as if there was no boundary at all. And suddenly he understood. The rain did not go anywhere. It became everything. The ground, the roots, the skin, the breath. The sky wasn't empty, it had simply let go. When Shiro returned the next morning, the abbot looked at him and asked, "Where does the rain go?" Shiro bowed and said nothing. That was enough. Moral of the story: detachment is not the escape from the storm, but the surrender to it. Koans are not meant to be solved, they are meant to dissolve us. The answer is not always found in silence, but in being fully soaked by the moment. When we stop resisting the rain, we become part of the sky that released it. The next story is called The Echo That Never Returned. In a vast valley surrounded by steep cliffs, there was a temple built near a sacred cave. The monks believed the cave held ancient wisdom, not in scriptures or relics, but in its echo. For generations, students would go there, speak a word, and listen for what came back. It was said the echo always revealed more than the voice itself. A young monk named Kain went one winter afternoon, burdened by a question that had haunted him for years. What is the self? He stood at the mouth of the cave, took a deep breath, and shouted, "Who am I?" The sound of his voice echoed back, "Who am I? Who am I?" fading slowly into stillness. He tried again, louder this time. "Who am I?" The cave answered again, "Who am I? I." He came back every day. He shouted different questions. What is truth? What is death? What should I let go of? The cave always answered, in his own voice, distorted and fading, but still there. Until one day, everything changed. He stood as always and whispered softly, "Who am I?" But this time, no echo returned. He frowned, stepped closer, and said it again, louder, then louder still. But the cave stayed silent. Not even a whisper came back. Fear flickered in his chest. Had he lost something? Had the cave stopped listening? Was he now invisible? Then, a strange calm washed over him. He sat down at the cave's edge and stopped speaking. He stopped seeking a sound in return. For the first time, he allowed the silence to be complete. And in that silence, something arose not in his ears, but deep within. There is no echo when nothing is thrown. His mind grew still. He wasn't empty, he was full of quiet. He returned to the temple changed, no longer restless, no longer chasing reflection. When another monk asked, "Did the cave answer you?" Cain smiled and said, "Yes." It stopped. Moral of the story. Sometimes the answer is the absence of reply. Detachment is not about being heard, it's about no longer needing an echo. When the mind stops shouting into the void, we begin to hear what was always beneath the noise. The greatest peace is when nothing comes back because nothing is missing. The next story is called The Dust Speck That Taught a Lesson. In a sunlit temple high on a mountain ridge, the monks polished everything until it shined. The floors gleamed like still water, the statues were smooth as moonlight, and even the bells had no rust. Cleanliness, they believed, reflected clarity of mind. Among the monks was a boy named Renji, just 15, eager to prove himself. He swept faster than anyone, wiped harder, and bowed lower. But inside, he was anxious. He wanted praise. He wanted to be perfect. One day, the head monk gave him a new task: clean the sacred altar. Renji took it as an honor. He scrubbed every inch, polished each candle holder, and inspected the space for any flaw. Hours passed. He checked once more, satisfied, and smiled. But just as he turned to leave, he noticed something on the edge of the golden altar bowl. A speck, tiny, floating, barely visible. Renji froze. He leaned in. It was so small, it might have been imagined. But it was there. Still, he reached for his cloth, then paused. Something inside him began to unravel. He had cleaned everything, done his best, and still dust, still imperfection. No matter how hard he tried, the world left its trace. Even in silence, even in reverence, a speck would always remain. He sat down, not out of defeat, but from a deep, quiet recognition. The dust was not the enemy, it was the teacher. He stayed there until evening, watching the light shift and the dust float gently through the air like thought itself ungraspable, always returning. When the head monk passed by and saw him sitting in stillness, he asked, "Is the altar clean?" Renji looked up, smiled, and said, "It will never be. And that's why I can finally rest." The monk bowed. No more needed to be said. Moral of the story. Detachment is not the end of effort, it is the end of perfectionism. We chase spotless lives, spotless thoughts, spotless selves, but the dust will always return. True peace comes not when everything is clean, but when we stop believing that it has to be. Sometimes, a single speck is enough to awaken the whole heart. The next story is called The Master Who Died Laughing at a Leaf. In the final years of his life, Master Haku lived alone at the edge of a forest, where the temple roof met the treetops and autumn arrived like a soft farewell. He no longer gave sermons. He no longer accepted students. He simply swept the path, drank tea, and sat quietly beneath an old maple tree whose roots cracked the stone beneath it. Monks would still come from far away, hoping to hear a final word, a final truth. But Haku would only smile and point to the trees, to the wind, to the sky, offering gestures instead of answers. One morning, a disciple named Jun arrived, bowing deeply before the old master. "Master," he said, "I have studied the teachings, sat through silence, lived with questions, but I still fear death. I still hold on." Haku said nothing. He motioned for Jun to sit. They sat for hours in silence beneath the maple. The wind rustled gently, and leaves began to fall one by one, spinning in the golden light. Jun waited for some wisdom to be spoken, but Haku only kept watching the sky. Then, without warning, a single leaf broke free from the highest branch. It didn't fall like the others. It twirled, paused mid-air, caught a breeze, and floated sideways gracefully, almost curious, before landing gently on Haku's open palm. He looked at it. Then he began to laugh, not softly, but deeply. Tears streamed down his cheeks. His shoulders shook. The laughter wasn't forced, it was light, free, like something that had been waiting his whole life to be released. Jun watched, stunned. Then slowly, the master stopped laughing. His eyes closed, and with a soft exhale, he died still, holding the leaf. No final words, no parting blessing, just laughter and a leaf. The monks buried him beneath the maple tree. They placed the leaf in the folds of his robe, and no one ever asked for his last teaching, because they had seen it. Moral of the story: true detachment is not in solemn silence, but in joyful release. To let go so completely that even death becomes light. The leaf falls, the life ends, and nothing is lost. When we stop clinging, we laugh. Because in that moment, we understand, nothing ever truly leaves. Everything simply changes form. The next story is called The Monk Who Entered Enlightenment Through a Knot. At the edge of a dense forest, where the fog clung to trees like breath, there was a monastery known for its silence. The monks there were skilled in meditation, in discipline, and in simplicity. But one monk named Cain was given a very different task by the abbot. "You are not to sit in the meditation hall this season," the abbot said. "Instead, you will tie knots." Cain bowed, confused. "Knots?" "Yes," the abbot replied. "Each morning, tie one knot. Each evening, untie it." And so Cain began. He was handed a long rope and a quiet corner in the garden. Each day he tied one knot with careful attention, and each evening he sat before it and slowly unraveled it. At first, it felt meaningless, like a game meant for children. But as the days passed, Cain noticed things. His hands, once clumsy, grew gentle. His breath slowed to match the rhythm of the rope. His thoughts, once tangled and loud, began to follow the motion of his fingers. Still, doubt lingered. "Is this real practice?" he thought. "Am I wasting time while others pursue truth?" One day, while tying a particularly difficult knot, he grew frustrated. The rope looped in strange ways. His hands slipped. The knot tightened too quickly, and he couldn't pull it back. He tried again, failed, tried again, still no use. Something inside him snapped, not in anger, but in surrender. He sat down, placed the rope in his lap, and breathed. For the first time, he didn't try to fix it. He only looked at it not as a problem, but as it was. And in that still moment, the knot looked different. Not wrong, not broken. Just a form, a shape the rope had taken for now. Cain smiled softly, and as he gently moved his fingers again, the knot loosened without resistance. That night, He did not untie the knot. He bowed to it. The next morning, he returned the rope to the abbot. "The knot is still there," he said, "but so is peace." The abbot nodded, eyes kind. Moral of the story: enlightenment does not always arrive through answers. It often slips in through tension we stop trying to fix. Detachment is the art of seeing the knot and no longer needing it to be undone. Sometimes, in accepting the tangle, we find the thread back to ourselves. The next story is called The Smile That Freed a City. Long ago, in a city ruled by fear and silence, people lived under the weight of constant tension. The streets were quiet, the markets dull, and even the temples echoed with caution. No one laughed in public. Smiles were rare and suspicious. The ruler was known to punish joy, believing it weakened control. Within this city lived an old monk named Now, who had never spoken much and never stirred attention. He swept the temple steps, bowed to the trees, and moved through life like a feather carried by still air. But Now had something different in him, something gentle, unshakable. No matter the gloom, he carried a quiet warmth in his eyes. He never preached, never resisted, never tried to awaken anyone. He simply smiled. Not a big grin, not a smile of defiance, just a soft, knowing curve at the corners of his lips, as if he had seen something no one else had and needed nothing more than to feel it quietly. One morning, in the city square, Now was sweeping when a guard approached him and snapped, "Why are you smiling?" Now paused. He looked up. The smile didn't vanish. "I'm not smiling at anything," he said gently. "The smile is simply here." The guard was stunned. No law had been broken, no threat made. He walked away, but something in him shifted. That night, he dreamed of his mother's voice for the first time in years. Word of the monk spread. People began to notice the small, kind gesture. Some feared it, others felt strangely comforted by it. Then one day, a child smiled back at him in the marketplace. Just for a moment. That moment turned into a chain shopkeepers, smiled at customers, neighbors shared bread, someone played music in the alley. Nothing grand happened, no rebellion, no declaration, but little by little, the heaviness lifted. Years later, when the ruler fell ill and power changed hands, the people did not celebrate with noise. They simply gathered in the square, each person standing still, eyes soft, mouths curved slightly upward. The city was quiet, but free. Moral of the story: detachment doesn't always look like distance. It can be the peaceful refusal to carry fear. A true smile is not reaction, it's presence. It does not need a reason, a defense, or permission. And sometimes, one quiet smile is enough to loosen the chains wrapped around an entire world. The next story is called The Candle That Cried Once. In a forgotten shrine hidden among plum trees, there was a small altar with a single white candle. Unlike the grand wax pillars used in ceremonies, this candle was ordinary, short, plain, and tucked into a quiet corner where few ever looked, yet the monks never moved it. It was said that the candle had burned only once, many years ago, during a silent night of mourning. It flickered softly in the dark while a beloved elder monk passed into death. That night, as the others sat in meditation, someone noticed a single drop of wax had slid down its side, slow, graceful, and still warm. It looked like a tear. From that moment on, the candle was never lit again. No one said why. No rule was made. It simply remained there, untouched. The monks began to call it the candle that cried once. Years later, a young monk named Hira arrived. He was full of questions, still raw with emotion from a difficult life. Loss had followed him like a shadow. He was diligent but wounded, always searching for something that would make the ache go away. One evening, during temple cleaning, Hira found himself alone in the corner where the candle sat. He picked it up gently. It felt lighter than it should have. He saw the dried tear of wax still clinging to the side. Moved by something he didn't understand, he took it to the abbot. "Master," he asked softly, "why was this candle only used once?" The abbot looked at him for a long time, then said, "Because once was enough." Hira didn't speak, but something in his chest began to loosen. The candle hadn't been preserved out of fear. It hadn't been discarded out of grief. It had been honored not for how brightly it burned, but for one honest, fleeting moment when it melted into something real. A tear, a flame, then stillness. That night, Hira sat beside the candle in silence, and for the first time in many years, he allowed himself to weep. Moral of the story: detachment is not the absence of feeling, it is the willingness to feel fully and then let go. Some moments don't need to last. Some lights only shine once, but that one shining can change a lifetime. What matters is not how long we burn, but that we are true while we do. The next story is called The Master Who Never Opened the Door. In a remote monastery built into the cliffs above a roaring sea, there lived a Zen master named Isshin. Pilgrims came from far and wide to seek his wisdom, for it was said he had attained a level of stillness so deep, even storms bent around his presence. But there was one thing about Isshin that puzzled everyone: he never opened his door. Visitors would arrive at the small wooden hut where he lived, bow respectfully, and knock. But no matter who came or how sincere their questions, the door remained closed. Many left confused, even angry. "How can he teach if he refuses to speak?" some muttered. Others camped outside for days, hoping he would let them in, but Isshin never responded. One day, a weary traveler named Katsu reached the hut after weeks of walking. He bowed low and knocked, then sat. No reply. He waited for hours, then stood and knocked again. "Please, master," he said softly, "I don't want answers. I just want to sit with you." Still, the door did not open. Katsu stayed through the night, and the next day, then a week. No questions, no begging. He simply sat, ate when hungry, slept under the stars, watched the sea. Slowly, something inside him began to shift. The ache to be accepted faded. The hunger for knowledge softened. He began to notice the wind's rhythm, the shape of the light on the stone, the sound of his own breath. Then, one morning after 12 days, he stood, bowed to the door one final time, and whispered, "Thank you." As he turned to leave, something surprising happened: not the door opening, but his own heart. He realized the door had never been closed. Not really. It had always pointed inward. And far inside that quiet space, a teaching had arrived without voice, without form. Moral of the story: detachment is the release of needing access, approval, or recognition. Sometimes the closed door is the teaching itself. When we stop demanding entry, we realize we were already inside. The truest masters don't open doors, they show us how to sit before them, and in the waiting, dissolve the walls within. The next story is called The One Who Asked a Question to a Pebble. In a small riverside monastery, a monk named Izu was known for asking too many questions. He questioned the masters, the scriptures, even the silence. He could not sit without wondering, what is this? Why is that? How does this lead to awakening? His mind never rested. Every moment was weighed, analyzed, dissected, and yet peace never came. One morning, while walking alone by the river's edge, Izu stumbled over a smooth pebble that rolled beneath his sandal. It was small, round, and pale-shaped by years of river flow. He picked it up absent-mindedly and turned it in his hand. The current murmured beside him. The sun warmed his skin. The air was still. Then, without thinking, Izu whispered to the pebble, "What is the meaning of all this?" He laughed softly at himself. It was absurd asking a stone what all the masters could not answer, but he kept holding it, his fingers brushing its worn surface. There was no voice, no miracle, no message from the sky. Only stillness. But that stillness felt different. It wasn't cold. It wasn't empty. It was full. The pebble did not explain, but it was. It had nothing to prove. It had no need to speak. And suddenly, Izu realized. It had always been listening. His question melted, not because it was answered, but because it no longer mattered. He sat by the river until the light shifted. He did not seek. He did not think. He simply existed like the pebble, quiet, present, enough. When he returned to the temple, he placed the pebble on his meditation cushion. From that day on, he never again asked his masters the questions that once consumed him. Instead, he learned to ask them to the world, then sit long enough to hear the silence answer back. Moral of the story: detachment is not the end of questions, it is the end of needing them to be answered. When we ask not to fix, but to feel, even a pebble becomes a teacher. The world replies, not with explanations, but with presence. And sometimes, the quietest things hold the loudest truth. The next story is called The Scroll That Dissolved in Rain. In a quiet mountain temple where fog lingered long into morning, there was a sacred scroll said to contain the final words of an enlightened master. It was kept sealed in silk, placed on a stone altar, and viewed only once each year during the first rainfall of spring. Monks believed the scroll held the perfect teaching, a sentence so pure, so complete, that anyone who truly saw it would awaken. Some imagined it was a secret koan. Others said it was the Buddha's essence written in ink. A young monk named Haku had waited 3 years to see the scroll. He had memorized sutras, fasted for weeks, and meditated through long, cold nights. When I read those words, he thought, everything will change. Finally, the spring rain came. The head monk gathered everyone in the courtyard and brought out the scroll. The rain was soft but steady, the kind that soaks gently without sound. The silk was unwrapped. Haku's heart pounded. The scroll was lifted. And then, something unexpected happened. As the elder began to unroll it, the parchment caught the rain and began to dissolve. The ink ran first, then the edges curled. The words, whatever they were, melted into streaks of black and brown, dripping down the stone. Gasps rose from the gathering. One monk rushed forward to protect it, but the elder gently raised a hand. "Let it be," he said. Haku stood frozen. Everything he had waited for gone in seconds. 1,000 questions surged through his chest. But then, a strange peace arrived. Because in the silence that followed, there was no lesson to cling to, no answer to memorize, only the rain, the dissolving ink, the scent of wet earth. And in that moment, Haku felt something break open, not with sound, but with stillness. Later, as the monks quietly returned to their quarters, the head monk approached Haku and whispered, "The scroll taught you well." Moral of the story: detachment is not losing the lesson, it's letting go of the need to preserve it. Truth is not always meant to be held. Sometimes it arrives only to dissolve, leaving behind nothing but presence. When we stop needing something to last, we finally see what's real. Like ink in rain, the message fades, but its echo remains forever in the heart. The next story is called The Wind That Became the Answer. In a monastery resting high on a cliff above the sea, the wind was a constant companion. It whistled through cracks in the wooden walls, rustled the robes of meditating monks, and danced over the surface of tea bowls. To most, it was background noise, just something to be endured. But to a monk named Kento, the wind became everything. Kento was not seeking comfort. He was seeking freedom. He had spent years trying to escape the weight of his thoughts, his fears, his endless need to understand. Koans confused him. Silence frustrated him, and no matter how long he sat, something in him still clung to control. One morning, during walking meditation, Kento paused beneath a tree. The branches above him shook with the breeze, leaves fluttering like thoughts he couldn't hold. He clenched his fists. He whispered, "What am I doing wrong?" The wind pushed against his chest. "Why can't I let go?" The wind tugged at his sleeves. He looked up at the sky, almost in anger, and shouted, "Then tell me, what is the answer?" At that exact moment, a gust of wind rushed past him, sharp, loud, full. It lifted dry leaves into the air, spun dust into light, and pushed through him with such force that it made him step back. And then, nothing. Stillness. Kento stood there, stunned. He felt his breath match the air. His thoughts stilled not because he forced them to, but because the wind had swept them away. Not just the loud thoughts, but even the silent grasping behind them. The answer had come, not as a word, not as an idea, but as a movement, a moment, a presence that was always there waiting for him to stop trying to hear it. He bowed deeply to the empty air. He no longer needed to ask. Moral of the story: detachment does not come from solving, but from surrendering. Some answers are not hidden, they are simply unheard beneath our own noise. When we stop demanding and start listening, even the wind can become a teacher. And sometimes the answer we seek is already passing through us. The next story is called The Child Who Taught the Roshi Without Words. In a quiet Zen temple shaded by flowering apricot trees, the Roshi, a revered teacher named Senzan, was known for his fierce clarity. His gaze alone could still a crowded room, and his words, though few, were studied like scripture. Students came from far provinces to sit at his feet, hungry for the truth he carried. But Senzan had grown weary. After decades of teaching, he noticed something changing in himself. His talks became quieter, his koans sharper. Yet inside, he felt a growing silence that unsettled him, not peace, but emptiness without light. He began to wonder, had the path gone dry? One spring morning, while walking the temple grounds, he noticed a young girl playing beneath the apricot trees. She had arrived with her mother, who brought offerings to the shrine. The child was no more than 5. Her robes were too big, and her sleeves dragged in the dirt as she wandered barefoot, giggling at falling petals. Senzan watched her closely. She picked up a single petal, held it to the sky, then let it go. Again, no thought, no ritual, just delight. She saw him watching, and instead of bowing or speaking, she simply smiled and reached out a hand, offering nothing, asking nothing. He didn't move, he didn't speak, but something in his chest cracked open like a seed in sunlight. The child danced in a circle, then sat cross-legged and stared at an ant crawling along a stone. She followed it with her eyes for minutes without moving, then simply stood and skipped away. No wisdom was spoken, no question was asked, but Senzan stood in the same spot long after she left. His breath had slowed, his thoughts had vanished. That afternoon, he cancelled his teachings. Not because he had no answers, but because the questions no longer mattered. When a senior monk asked if something was wrong, Senzan replied, "A child came and returned my eyes." Moral of the story: detachment is not distance, it's innocence returned. Sometimes the deepest teachings come not from great effort, but from effortless presence. When the mind stops trying to know and simply sees, wisdom flows without words. And in a single moment of wonder, even a master can be reminded what it means to awaken. The next story is called The Breath That Vanished Mid-Sentence. In a temple where the mountains met the sky, there lived a monk named Riku, known for his way with words. He recited sutras with clarity, taught beginners with patience, and spoke with a voice that felt like soft water over stones. Many came to him seeking wisdom, and he always had something to say, gentle, wise, and composed. But deep inside, Riku feared stillness. Not outer silence, he knew how to sit in quiet but inner stillness, the kind that didn't reach for meaning, the kind that allowed things to end before they made sense. One autumn evening, Riku was invited to give a talk to visiting monks. As the wind curled through the hall and leaves scraped softly outside, he stood before them, hands steady, breath calm. He began to speak. The way of the Dharma is like a path through mist. We take one step, then another. But if we seek too much, And then, mid-sentence, his breath caught. Not from nerves, not from distraction. It simply vanished. No air moved, no word followed. He paused. The monks waited, silent. He opened his mouth again, but no sound came. Not because he had forgotten, but because something within him no longer needed to finish. He stood there, eyes wide, not in panic, but in awe. For the first time in his life, there was no more to say. Not because the thought ended, but because it had been fully met. He bowed quietly, sat down, and did not speak again that night. No one asked questions, no one needed to. In that unfinished breath, something more had arrived, something purer than teaching. Later, the abbot said, "The sentence may have stopped, but the truth kept going." From then on, Riku spoke less, but when he did, it was with the softness of someone who had finally met silence and didn't fear its return. Moral of the story: detachment is the release of needing to complete everything, prove everything, explain everything. Sometimes the deepest truth lives in the moment we stop speaking. When the breath vanishes mid-sentence, what remains is presence and polished, unforced, whole. In the pause, awakening waits. The next story is called The Drum That Only Played in Stillness. In a misty forest temple where clouds drifted low enough to touch, there was a ceremonial drum said to be blessed by silence itself. It was large, carved from cedar, with a skin stretched tight over its frame, like the breath of the earth held still. But this drum was unlike any other. No matter how hard it was, struck by stick, by hand, even by chant, it would make no sound. The monks called it the silent heart, and for generations no one had heard it speak. Young monks often tried to unlock its mystery. Some beat it with rhythm, others offered prayers. One even fasted for 7 days before tapping it with trembling fingers. Still nothing. One day, a new monk named Sora arrived. He was different. He didn't rush to impress. He didn't ask questions. He swept the floors, listened to the rain, and meditated beneath the plum trees. When he learned about the silent drum, he didn't try to strike it. He simply sat beside it. Every morning at sunrise, he would place his cushion near the drum and breathe. He never touched it, never spoke. He just sat, eyes open, listening not for sound, but for stillness. Days passed, then weeks. The other monks laughed quietly. "The drum has no voice," they said. "Why wait for what doesn't come?" But Sora stayed, not to awaken the drum, but to learn how to hear beyond hearing. Then, one morning, as the mist clung low and the world was utterly still, the drum released a single, soft note. No one had touched it. It was not loud, not clear, but it moved through the hall like breath through a sleeping body. The monks ran to see what had happened, but Sora didn't move. A single tear rolled down his cheek, not from surprise, but from recognition. Later, the abbot said to him, "How did you do it?" Sora replied, "I didn't." The drum spoke when it was quiet enough to be heard. Moral of the story: some truths only reveal themselves when all striving stops. Detachment is not silence from the world. It is the silence within us that allows the world to speak. In true stillness, we discover the drum never lacked sound. We simply never stopped long enough to hear it. The next story is called The Zen Garden That Rearranged Itself. In the courtyard of a centuries-old monastery stood a famous Zen garden, stones carefully placed among fine white gravel, raked each morning into perfect waves. Monks would rise before dawn to tend it, moving with slow intention, believing that to shape the garden was to shape the mind. Among them was a monk named Taro, precise and proud in his work. He raked the lines straighter than anyone, adjusted the stones with quiet reverence, and made sure not even a single leaf disturbed the stillness. Every curve had meaning, every space a metaphor. One evening, after a day of silent practice, Taro stayed behind in the courtyard. The moon hung low, the temple quiet, the wind still. He admired the garden and felt proud it was exactly as it should be. But that night, a wind came, not strong, but restless. It passed through the trees and over the courtyard like a hand through water. Gravel shifted, a small stone tilted. A leaf dropped and spun in lazy circles across the once perfect lines. In the morning, Taro returned early. He stopped. The garden was no longer what he had shaped. The patterns were broken. One stone had rolled several inches. He bent down, ready to begin, again ready to fix. But then he paused. Something about the garden felt alive, as if, in its imperfection, it had breathed. The new curves in the gravel weren't messy, they were soft. The leaf sat perfectly between two stones, like it had chosen its own place. He stepped back, looked again, and for the first time, he didn't touch a thing. Instead, he sat beside it and wept, not from sadness, but from release. All these years, he had tried to perfect the garden, but in one night, the wind had done something more honest. It had let the garden become. From that day forward, Taro still raked, but he stopped shaping. He listened. He allowed. He let the wind rearrange what it needed to. Moral of the story: detachment is not the end of carrot, is the end of control. We spend our lives raking patterns into sand, trying to hold still what was never meant to stay. But sometimes, the wind teaches us better. When we stop forcing the design, life begins to draw itself, and the garden, like the soul, arranges what we could never plan. The next story is called The Bird That Sang the Dharma. High in the mountains, where clouds rested like soft blankets across pine branches, a temple stood hidden from all roads. The monks there lived in deep simplicity, no chanting bells, no ceremonies, no great teachers, just silence, breath, and sky. Among them was an old monk named Tenrin, whose hearing had faded with time. He could no longer follow conversations, no longer hear the gongs that called to meditation. And yet, he smiled more than anyone else. He never missed a sitting, never missed the sunrise. He seemed to carry something weightless inside him. One spring, a small bird began nesting in the beams above the meditation hall. It was golden-breasted and thin-voiced, and no one could name its kind. Every morning before dawn, it would sing. Not loud, but with a clarity that made even the wind pause to listen. The monks at first were distracted by its sound, delicate, spontaneous, wild. Some thought to scare it off. But Tenrin would always shake his head gently, eyes closed, as if to say, "Let it be." Day after day, as others struggled with posture, with stillness, with restless minds, Tenrin sat beneath the bird, breathing in rhythm with its song. One morning, after weeks of watching him, a younger monk asked, "Master Tenrin, what sutra do you meditate on?" Tenrin opened his eyes, smiled, and pointed upward. "The bird?" the monk asked, puzzled. "But it doesn't recite any teachings." Tenrin shook his head and whispered, "It does. You're just trying too hard to translate it." The monk returned the next day, not trying to listen for meaning, but simply with presence. Slowly, he too began to hear not the bird's song, but his own mind becoming quiet in its presence. The bird left by midsummer. No one saw it go. But something remained, an echo not in the air, but in the way the monks now walked, breathed, and bowed. They called it the Dharma that flew on wings. Moral of the story: not all teachings come from books or voices. Detachment is not found in mastering words, but in letting go of the need to grasp meaning. Sometimes the deepest truths are sung without knowing they are songs. When we stop trying to understand, we begin to listen, and in that listening, we are changed. The next story is called The Cloud That Blocked All Thought. On a high plateau where the air was thin and the sky felt close enough to touch, a Zen monk named Arai wandered in solitude. He had left his monastery behind, not in rebellion, but in search of stillness. His mind, though quiet in speech, was noisy in thought. Even as he meditated, his mind would swirl plans, memories, philosophies, subtle desires, disguised as spiritual questions. He didn't chase the world anymore, but the world still clung to him through thought. One late afternoon, while climbing a narrow ridge, he paused to rest. The sky was clear, painted in soft gold. But as he sat, a large grey cloud began to drift across the sun, casting a shadow over the landscape. The warmth vanished, the world dimmed, and in that shadowed silence, something happened. Arai's mind stopped. Not slowed, not focused, stopped. The cloud covered everything. Inside him, all the mental motion froze. No teachings, no doubts, no plans. Just a great stillness, both heavy and weightless. He could not explain it. He did not try. There was no name, no effort, no understanding. Just presence. A sacred emptiness that was not hollow, but full of quiet. He sat for hours, unmoving, his breath barely noticed. When the cloud finally drifted on and the light returned, he did not feel the need to follow it. He stood slowly, bowed to the sky, and whispered, "Thank you." Not for clarity, not for vision, but for absence. From that moment on, Arai no longer fought his thoughts. He no longer chased stillness. Instead, he waited like the mountain waits, knowing that sometimes the mind is cleared not by effort, but by something passing over it, something beyond control. Moral of the story: detachment is not achieved by silencing the mind, but by allowing something greater to still it. Sometimes, the deepest peace comes not through answers, but through pause. When a cloud blocks all thought, it does not take something away, returns us to what was always there beneath the noise, pure, silent being. The next story is called The Rice Grain That Enlightened a Farmer. In a quiet village where the fields bowed golden beneath the autumn sun, lived a humble farmer named Daichi. He was not a monk, nor did he know the sutras. His life was simple: wake before dawn, tend the rice, eat when hungry, sleep when tired. Yet inside him lived a constant, aching, unspoken restlessness that no harvest could ease. One year, the rains came late, the soil hardened, crops struggled. Daichi worked harder than ever, breaking his back for every handful of grain. His hands cracked, his clothes stiff with sweat, and still, his heart felt empty. One evening, exhausted beyond words, he sat by the edge of his field, watching the wind ripple through the rice like the breath of something unseen. He opened his calloused hand and stared at a single grain that had fallen from his basket. It was ordinary, small, almost nothing, yet something in its stillness held him there. For a long time, he simply stared. He thought of the rains it needed, the sunlight it absorbed, the soil it grew in, the hands that planted it. He thought of how easily it could be crushed, or dropped, or forgotten. But in that grain lived 1,000 things: clouds, storms, time, and care. It was everything, and yet it asked for nothing. And suddenly, Daichi's breath slowed. The ache in his chest loosened. He laughed softly like a child, like an old man, like someone who'd just remembered something he never knew he'd forgotten. He placed the grain gently on the ground and whispered, "Thank you." The next morning, Daichi returned to his field, not with urgency, but with peace. Every step was lighter, every movement quieter. His work was no longer a struggle, it was prayer. Villagers noticed a change in him. When asked what had happened, he said only, "I saw the whole universe in a single grain of rice." Moral of the story: enlightenment does not always arrive on mountaintops. Sometimes it rests in the palm of your hand. Detachment is the moment you stop waiting for something greater and see the greatness in what already is. Even the smallest grain can awaken the heart if we are still enough to see it. The next story is called The Monk Who Counted to Zero. In a quiet temple at the edge of a rice plain, there lived a monk named Haruki who was obsessed with progress. He counted everything: his steps during walking meditation, his breaths during zazen, the number of sutras he memorized, even how many grains of rice he ate. To Haruki, progress meant numbers going up, more stillness, more hours of practice, more moments of peace, more understanding. He filled journals with tallies and charts, convinced that one day the numbers would lead him to enlightenment. One evening, the old abbot watched as Haruki counted his boson hand on prayer beads, the other pressing into the floor, lips whispering, 98, 99. Before Haruki could say 100, the abbot placed his hand gently on the monk's shoulder and said, "Start again, but this time, count down." Haruki blinked. "Count down?" The abbot nodded. "From 100 to 0. Haruki obeyed. The next morning, he sat on his cushion and began. 100, 99, 98. Each day, he counted lower, and with each number, something inside him quieted. The need to achieve softened. The desire to reach something began to dissolve. As he moved closer to 0, he noticed the space between numbers growing wider, not in time, but in feeling. Fewer thoughts, fewer expectations, less of everything. Finally, on the last morning, he sat down in silence. He breathed in and whispered, 1. He breathed out and said nothing. There was no 0, no word, no finish. Just breath, just presence, just stillness. He sat for hours. The beads slipped from his fingers. The journal lay untouched, and for the first time, Haruki felt no need to measure anything at all. Later that day, the abbot passed by and asked, "How far did you get?" Haruki smiled. "I arrived nowhere." The abbot bowed. "Then you are almost free." Moral of the story: detachment begins when we stop counting our worth. In a world that praises more, the soul longs for less. True peace is not found in adding, but in subtracting. When you reach 0, there is nothing left to become, only space to be. And in that empty space, everything waits. The next story is called The Candle's Shadow That Pointed North. In a small mountain temple where snow softened every sound, there lived a monk named Riku, who was known for his questions. Not the loud, kind, but quiet, persistent ones that followed him even in sleep. He sought direction, not just in the literal sense, but in life. "Which path leads to truth?" he often whispered during meditation. "How do I know I'm not wandering in circles?" The head monk, Master Yori, gave him a task: to keep the meditation hall lit through the longest night of winter, one candle at a time, until dawn. "Sit with it," Yori said, "and watch closely." So Riku sat. The night was long and cold. Each candle he lit gave off a gentle flame, a small warmth, and each one cast a shadow that danced on the wooden floor and stone walls, never still, never the same. Hours passed. Shadows stretched in every direction, some leaned east, some west, some flickered wildly in confusion. But near midnight, the wind outside calmed. The air inside grew still. Riku lit a fresh candle and placed it in the center of the hall. Its flame stood tall and quiet, and for the first time, its shadow fell in only one direction long, dark and straight. North. He didn't move, he only stared. The flame burned, and the shadow held steady. Something inside him stilled. It wasn't the flame that gave him direction, it was the shadow. In that moment, he understood. All this time, he had waited for light to lead him, but sometimes it is what the light reveals through contrast that quietly shows the way. At sunrise, he told Master Yori what he had seen. The old monk nodded and said, "Even the light does not point. It simply burns, but in its honesty, it casts a truth you can follow." From that day forward, Riku no longer asked which way to go. He simply walked with stillness, letting the shadows fall where they may. Moral of the story: detachment is not about forcing clarity, it's about allowing it to appear through stillness. Sometimes we find our path not in the light itself, but in the shadow it leaves behind. When we stop trying to force direction, even a candle's flicker can point us home. The next story is called The Gate That Could Only Be Opened by Silence. There was a monastery hidden in a misty valley, surrounded by mountains, so steep that few ever found their way to it. At the heart of the monastery stood an ancient wooden gate, tall and heavy, carved with symbols no one could read. It was called the Inner Gate, and it remained closed at all times. It led to a small garden said to hold the deepest teachings of the Templino in books or words, but in pure presence. Many monks tried to open it. Some knocked gently, others waited beside it for hours. A few even recited sutras or whispered prayers, hoping the gate would hear and swing open. But nothing happened. Years passed, and the gate stayed shut. Then came a young monk named Jun, quiet by nature. He did not ask questions or seek special teachings. He simply swept the walkways, gathered wood, and bowed to whatever the day gave him. One evening, as the sun faded and shadows stretched across the stone floor, Jun walked past the gate. He didn't stop. He didn't stare, but something pulled at him, not with desire, but with stillness. So he sat, back straight, hands resting on his knees, eyes open, not thinking, not waiting, just breathing. He sat through the deep blue of twilight, through the owl's call, through the cold. And in the middle of the night, when the stars were sharp and the world had gone completely still, the gate opened, without sound, without anyone touching it. The wooden doors eased apart, like petals opening in darkness. Jun stood and stepped through. He did not look surprised. He only bowed once and entered the garden. There was nothing inside. No statue, no scripture, just moonlight on stone, just wind, just silence. And in that silence, something vast unfolded inside him. He never spoke of what he felt there. He never needed to. From that night forward, he walked slower, laughed softer, and others around him began to feel lighter without knowing why. Moral of the story: detachment is not the key that opens life's deepest truth. Silence is. When we stop trying to push, to ask, to earn, the gate begins to shift. Not because we force it, but because stillness is the only invitation it ever needed. Some doors were never meant to be opened by words, only by presence. The next story is called The Master Who Gave Up His Name. In a forest monastery hidden among mist-covered hills, there lived a Zen master once known across the land for his teachings. His name, Shozen, was spoken with reverence. Scrolls carried his words. Disciples memorized his lectures. His name was etched into temple stones, sung in chants, and written in ink, so black it seemed to weigh the page. But one morning, without warning, Master Shozen called his students together. His voice was calm, his eyes like still water. "Today," he said, "I give up my name." A hush fell. One monk gasped. Another dropped his brush mid-stroke. "What do you mean, Master?" one student asked. Shozen smiled. "From this day on, I am no longer Shozen. That name has served its time. Let it rest." Confused, the students begged for explanation. "Your name is your legacy. Your teachings are tied to it. How will others remember you?" But the master simply turned and walked into the forest, barefoot, humming an unfamiliar tune. Days passed. The monks left food at his hut but didn't speak his name. He did not stop teaching, simply taught in silence, in gesture, in shared tea, in the way he lit a candle or swept the floor. Over time, something shifted in the monastery. With no name to praise or follow, the students began to listen more deeply to the moment itself, not the master's identity. They stopped quoting and started seeing. One day, a traveler arrived at the temple gates and asked, "Which of you is the great Master Shozen?" A young monk replied, "He left long ago." "But isn't this the temple of his teachings?" the traveler asked. The monk smiled. "Yes, but now the teachings have no owner. They live by themselves." Years later, after the master's death, no plaque was hung, no statue raised. Only a simple rock was placed in the garden where he used to sit. On it was carved, "No name, no trace, just presence." Moral of the story: detachment is the release not just of things, but of identity. When we stop needing a name, we stop needing to be remembered and we begin to truly live. The most lasting truths leave no footprints. They are not carried by names, but by the silence that remains after the name is gone. The next story is called "The Flame That Refused to Flicker." In the center of a windswept monastery built from stone and silence, a single candle was kept burning day and night inside the meditation hall. It sat at the base of a plain altar, enclosed in a simple glass lantern. The monks called it the still flame. No matter how strong the wind outside, no matter how cold or hot the season, the flame never flickered. It didn't sway, it didn't tremble, it stood straight, steady, and unmoved. Many monks saw it as a symbol of discipline. Some believed it was a miracle. Others whispered that the flame held the spirit of a master long past. But one young monk named Sota became fascinated, not by the stories but by the mystery. How can it remain still, he wondered, when everything else moves? He spent days observing it. He sat beside it during zazen. He opened windows to let wind in, trying to disturb it. Nothing changed. The flame burned on, calm, vertical, unwavering. Sota became frustrated. "What's your secret?" he whispered one night, staring at the flame as if it might whisper back. And then something subtle happened. In his stillness, his question fell quiet. His thoughts stopped swirling, and for the first time, he stopped watching the flame and began to feel it. It wasn't resisting the air. It wasn't trying to hold still. It simply was. It had no fear of being blown out, no pride in burning clean. It didn't perform stillness, it rested in it. And suddenly, Sota realized the flame was not unaffected by the world. It had simply stopped reacting to it. The next day, when others asked him why he sat for so long with the candle, he just smiled. He no longer needed it to flicker to believe it was alive. Moral of the story: detachment is not the absence of feeling, it is the absence of reaction. Like a flame that refuses to flicker, the awakened heart stays steady, not because the world is calm, but because it no longer moves in fear or need. Peace is not found in the silence around you, but in the silence within you that holds steady, no matter the wind. The next story is called The Sand That Formed a Sutra. In a monastery by the sea, where the tide whispered ancient songs into the rocks, the monks practiced a rare ritual each spring. They would rise before dawn and walk in silence to the shore, carrying bowls of dry sand collected from the cliff paths. At sunrise, they would pour the sand into soft patterned spirals, lines, waves on the wet beach, then sit and meditate until the ocean came to take it away. A young monk named Tetsu had joined the temple only months earlier. Eager and sincere, he didn't understand the point of the ritual. "Why create what will disappear?" he asked his teacher. The teacher only said, "Watch closely and pour with presence." When the morning came, Tetsu followed the others to the shore. The sky glowed pale gold. The monks moved slowly, hands steady, spilling dry grains into delicate shapes, an offering that would soon vanish. Tetsu knelt and traced a small spiral, careful not to rush. His fingers trembled. Each grain seemed weightless, but together they told something silent. As he poured, a strange calm filled him. He forgot his confusion, his effort. His breath matched the rhythm of the waves. Then came the tide. The first wave touched the edge of his pattern. He held his breath. The second wave pulled half of it away. By the third, the design was gone. Tetsu felt sadness rise in his chest then. Just as quickly, it melted. Because in the space where the spiral had been, something more honest remained. The sand, smoothed again, unwritten, unclaimed, free. His teacher approached and said softly, "You have just read a sutra that no ink can hold." Tetsu nodded. And though nothing remained on the shore, something had settled inside him. From that day, he stopped clinging to the permanence of his actions. He swept the temple floors as if drawing in sand. He spoke gently, wrote letters he never sent, gave without waiting to be seen. Moral of the story: detachment is not the absence of creation, it is the freedom to create without needing to preserve. When we write in sand, we learn that beauty is not in lasting, but in being present. And when the ocean returns, it does not erase the sutrate, completes it. The next story is called The Mountain That Moved for No One. There was once a monk named Rian who traveled far and wide, searching for the most powerful teachers he could find. He crossed deserts, sailed to islands, and climbed steep cliffs, all in pursuit of someone who could finally give him the answer that would silence his restless heart. One day, he heard of a mountain in the east that was said to be the oldest and most silent teacher of all. It had no name, no trails, no shrine, only stone, wind, and sky. It was said the mountain held the wisdom of lifetimes, but only revealed its truth to those who truly listened. Ryan went. He brought nothing but a robe and a bowl. He climbed the base and sat down. Then he asked, "What is the nature of the self?" The mountain said nothing. He asked, "What happens after death?" No answer, only the sound of the breeze pushing through the pines. He asked about enlightenment, about karma, about emptiness. Still no reply. Days passed, then weeks. He meditated in the cold, fasted through rain, chanted sutras into the wind. But the mountain never moved, never gave, never answered. Frustrated and exhausted, Ryan shouted, "Why won't you teach me?" The echo came back, only his own voice. And then he stopped. He let the silence fall, completely. He no longer expected anything. He no longer demanded to be shown, healed, or freed. He simply sat, as the mountain did. And in that stillness, something strange happened. He felt the mountain inside him, not as stone, not as mass, but as stillness, as presence. It wasn't that the mountain refused to teach. It had been teaching all along by not moving, by being exactly as it was, unshaken, unimpressed, untouched. And Rian, for the first time, understood what it meant to be, not to change, not to seek, just to rest as you are. He bowed deeply not to get an answer, but because he no longer needed one. Moral of the story: detachment is not about going somewhere else, it's about becoming like the mountain, unmoved by praise, untouched by fear, unchanged by the passing winds of thought. The world may beg you to shift and react, but stillness teaches you this: when you no longer chase the answer, you have already arrived. The next story is called The Hand That Waved Goodbye to Thought. At a monastery carved into the cliffs above a roaring gorge, a monk named Anjo struggled with a mind that never stopped moving. Even in silence, his thoughts stampeded memories, plans, fears, questions. He could sit for hours without moving, but inside, it felt like he was running. He had studied every method to tame the mind, counting breaths, repeating mantras, visualizing rivers and clouds. Still, the thoughts came. Gentle ones, loud ones, old ones. And every time he tried to silence them, they only grew stronger. One evening, after yet another restless meditation, Anjo went to the old master, who sat beneath a willow tree brushing fallen leaves into his robe as if they were words. "I've tried everything," Anjo said, "but my thoughts won't leave." The master looked at him and smiled faintly. Then, without speaking, he raised one hand, and slowly he waved. A soft, casual, almost playful gesture, like saying goodbye to an old friend at a train station. Then he went back to brushing the leaves. Anjo blinked. "Master, what does that mean?" But the master said nothing. Confused, Anjo returned to the meditation hall. He sat. The thoughts came, as always. But this time, instead of tightening, he lifted his hand and gently waved to them. Not to push them away, not to reject them, just to acknowledge, "I see you, thank you, goodbye." One thought came. "I'm not doing this right," he waved. Another, "What if I never find peace?" He waved. A memory, a regret, a hope, each time just a wave. And slowly, the thoughts lost their grip. They passed like travelers in a station, no longer needing a place to stay. He laughed quietly, not in triumph, but in freedom. That night, he slept without dreams. From that day on, when monks asked him for advice, Anjo would raise his hand and wave. Moral of the story: detachment is not silencing the mind, it is no longer following it. Thoughts will come and go, but we are not their destination. When we greet them like passing strangers and wave goodbye without grasping, we discover the stillness that was never lost, only hidden behind the noise. The next story is called The Monk Who Was Enlightened by a Spider's Patience. In the deep stillness of a forest temple, a young monk named Kenji struggled with restlessness. He practiced with sincerity, rising early, bowing low, sitting long, but inside, he was constantly asking, "When will it happen?" He had read of great awakenings that arrived like lightning, of masters struck by sudden insight while sweeping or sipping tea. He longed for his moment, for the flash, the shift, the certainty, and the longer it didn't come, the more agitated he grew. One morning, after meditation, the abbot sent Kenji to a forgotten corner of the temple to clean an old, unused room. Dust clung to every surface, and the air was thick with silence. As Kenji reached to wipe a high beam, he paused. There, in the corner, hung a single spider, motionless in the center of a fragile, perfect web. The sunlight caught the silk, and the whole web shimmered like breath. Kenji stared. He expected the spider to move, to do something, but it didn't. It simply waited. Still, unshaken. Minutes passed. Then a fly buzzed near. The spider didn't leap. It didn't chase. It waited until the right moment, and then moved. One step. Precise, effortless. It struck not from urgency, but from deep patience. Kenji felt his breath catch. He saw his own heart constantly moving, chasing, waiting for something to arrive. But the spider had no tension. It simply was. In that moment, Kenji felt something soften inside. The tight knot of desire loosened. He sat down, dust all around him, and let go. There was no flash, no thunder, just a stillness clear and full that felt like home. He never told the abbot what happened in that room. He didn't need to. The next morning, he swept slower, bowed deeper, and smiled more easily. And when a novice asked, "What was your greatest teacher?" Kenji answered, "A spider who didn't need to hurry." Moral of the story: detachment is not giving up the path, it's releasing the urgency to arrive. Like the spider, awakening comes not through chasing, but through waiting with full presence. When the heart stops reaching, it becomes a web that catches truth without effort. Patience isn't empty, it's prepared. And in that stillness, realization gently lands. After journeying through 3 hours of Zen stories to help you detach and feel lighter, you've walked barefoot across still gardens, listened to silent teachers, watched bamboo wait, pebbles speak, and candles weep. You've met monks who found truth in clouds, in patience, in breath, in nothing at all. These stories were not meant to impress your mind, but to lighten your spirit. In the quiet moments between each tale, you may have noticed, the weight you carried softened, the questions grew quieter, and something in you let go. Detachment doesn't mean you drift away, it means you return more gently to yourself. And perhaps, through a knot, a whisper, or a single falling leaf, you already have. If one of these stories touched you, we invite you to share it in the comments. Which one stayed with you? Your insight could be the silence someone else needs. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel for more stories that don't just tell but transform. Stillness is waiting. We'll be here when you're ready to return.